Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 551st Board Meeting of the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board. I would like to introduce the board members and staff at this time. On my far left is Raji Barr from Bakersfield. Sitting next to Raji is Carmen Ramirez of Atwater. On my direct left is John Constantino of Grass Valley. On my far right is Dan Markham of Falls River. And later this morning, Bob Snyder of Davis will be joining us. Directly here on my right is Denise Cadera, Vice Chair of the Board, and she hails from Allensworth. My name is Carl Longley of Fresno. I'll now introduce the Executive Officer, Pamela Creedon, who will introduce her staff.
Good morning, Dr. Longley and members of the board. Sorry, I'm busy on my... good morning. So across the room from me to my left is Andrew Altavogt, Assistant Executive Officer in the Sacramento office, and next to Andrew is Stephanie Yu, Senior Staff Counsel for the board. To my far left is Kieran Lanfranchi Rizzardi, Executive Assistant to the board. Next to Kieran is Adam Lapitz, Assistant Executive Officer in the Sacramento office, and to my immediate left is Andrew Dieringer for his last board meeting with us, Staff Counsel for the board. And Andrew's leaving to go to water rights. And to my immediate right is Patrick Paluba, Senior Staff Counsel for the board. In the audience we have Clint Snyder, Assistant Executive Officer in the Reading office, and Clay Rogers, Assistant Executive Officer in the Fresno office. And we have a number of staff people in the audience, and I don't know if Tam Doduk is here today. We didn't hear from her.
I believe she is not here today. Hopefully she can join us tomorrow. Thank you very much. Carmen, could you lead us in the pledge?
Salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the approval of the minutes. The minutes are in the folder that's provided to you on your desk. And we have, first of all, we have two sets of minutes here. Both draft minutes of the Thursday, February 23rd meeting and the Thursday, April 6th meeting. We'll take them one at a time. Do I have a motion on the February 23rd minutes?
I move.
Denise has moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Carmen seconded. All in, we need a roll call on this? Yeah.
Dr. Markham?
Aye.
Ms. Ramirez? Yes. Ms. Brar?
Yes.
Mr. Costantino?
Aye.
Ms. Kadara?
Yes.
Dr. Longley?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Entertain a motion on the April 6th, 7th meeting.
I'll make the motion. I'll second it.
Denise has moved and Dan seconded. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Chair, before they call the roll, I was only present for the second day of the meeting, so even though I will be voting on this item, I just want to make it clear that I only participated in the second day of the hearing.
That's so noted. Thank you.
And I guess I should note, I wasn't at the meeting in Fresno, so I'll be abstaining.
Okay. Call the roll, please.
Dr. Markham?
Aye.
Ms. Brar?
Yes.
Ms. Ramirez? Yes. Mr. Costantino?
Abstain.
Ms. Kadara?
Yes.
Dr. Longley?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Just for the board members' information, this device here that's supposed to, oh, there we got it finally working. I was going to tell you that it wasn't working,
But then you tapped on it and it worked.
yeah, I know. They were working with it this morning and it wasn't working at last when they finished. But oh, it's not working reliably. I hear from the sidelines over there. So if you're trying to get my attention, you may have to throw something at me. Like a binder? Yeah, those things are heavy too. Okay. With that said, we'll move on and talk about meeting procedures. In order to conduct our regional board meetings in a fair and efficient manner, we will be proceeding in accordance with the meeting procedures that have been provided with a summary agenda and are available here at the staff table and upon request. And they're also posted on the board's website and are summarized on the computer screens during the breaks. Any questions or comments regarding these procedures may be directed to Karen Lanfranchi Rosardi, our administrative assistant, who sits here at the staff table. Takes us item number 3 on the agenda, board member communications. Are there any communications?
Yes, Dr. Longley, I met with Justin Salters, who represents CalFlows, on May 8th, and we discussed beneficial use of treated and produced water.
Very good. Anybody else?
Go ahead, Dan.
On May 15th, I made a call to Ned Coe. He's a regional Farm Bureau rep up in northeastern California. And I called him because I wanted to see a little bit more interest from grassroots farmers in irrigated lands. And so that's what we chatted about, is that, you know, even though we have a number of people in the audience who represent groups of growers, I still like to hear from individual growers. So I said, get the word out and get more people to pay attention. We do a webcast. We've got a tremendous amount of information on the web. More informed public come up with better ideas as we move forward.
Thank you. Any further comments?
So this isn't necessarily communication so much as because we had a public board meeting, a workshop, I should say, where Dr. Longley and Dan and Bob so kindly joined me, and we had a workshop on our climate change, regional climate change work plan. And so that was on June 1st, and I believe that was webcast, so anybody who wanted to see it could, and I think it was a pretty good meeting. I thank Andrew and staff for making that possible.
Any further questions or, not questions, any further comments?
On April 27th, I participated in the Community Water Leaders Network. It's a monthly meeting time where we discuss issues related to small water systems, disadvantaged communities, and we discuss a number of issues that impact the disadvantaged communities, and it's a worthwhile group to participate in. So when you're going through issues and dealing with what type of operators to get, and if you need any assistance with insurance, and the network is available to provide that assistance to the disadvantaged communities and the community services district. So I participate in that on a monthly basis. The last session we had was a roundtable discussion, May 26th, the day after Memorial Day. And we were talking about the different water rates that we're trying to come up with based on the state legislation that was passed, was it last year, I think, for water rates. And then also I'm participating in the Atwell Island project. It's a work-based learning program, and this is a program that we've developed that actually got underway a couple of days ago. This is with disadvantaged youth in the community of Allensworth and Alpar High School students, and we brought them together to work with them and give them a career path focusing on science, and the real issue is dealing with water. So that project got underway a couple of days ago. 14 students, 7 from Allensworth High School, 7 from Alpar, and they will be going through a rigorous process of learning, dealing with wetlands, dealing with drinking water, the problems that we encounter in our communities, and there have been several in this past year that we've been involved with. But the students, we are wanting them to get the education and the training so they become the voice in the community. They become the ones that want to go into water and to address some of the issues, and most important, just become environmentally conscious of the environment and how to protect it. And it's a worthwhile program for our young people, and just excited to be a part of it. It's a tremendous amount of coordination with the Tulare County Office of Education, Tulare Basin Wildlife Partners, and a number of agencies that are working with us. And in fact, we actually got a request from the Strategic Growth Council. They're interested in funding the project. So it's stuff that I've been talking about here on the board because I just think it's important to educate people in the community. And if you start working with the youth, it gives us a chance that something will continue to go forth. So glad to be a part of it, and I'll be more than happy to provide more updated information as it comes forth. But this program will end at the end of June. The students will get a stipend for their participation in it, and they will actually do a presentation. I think we will have representation from the state board. Will actually come out and do a presentation to the youth and give them a presentation as well. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, on May 2nd of this year, the Latino Chamber of Commerce of Sacramento invited me as an appointed official to an event. The event was more social in nature, but it was about the Chamber's efforts to continue to lobby the legislature about the importance of California's relationship with Mexico and Mexico's participation in California regarding its economics, the participation of immigrants in important rights that affect the state. And so even though it was not related to water issues specifically, the reason that I was invited is because I am an appointed member to this board.
Thank you very much, Carmen. On May 15th, I had a telephone conversation with Dr. Hugh Rinsarts. He runs a laboratory in the Netherlands that works with industry. They have a focus on salt, hence my interest. And some of the technologies they're looking at could have a role in this valley as we go forward with S salts. I'll be out of country on vacation, but while I'm on vacation, I'll be visiting his laboratory in July. That'll be exciting. Then on the 25th of May, Pamela Creedon and I attended the Groundwater Resources Association Contemporary Groundwater Issues Council meeting, of which we're both a member of that council. And it was a day-long event. Very good information was presented. On the 2nd of June, I had the pleasure of having lunch with Casey Kramer, who's in the audience, and didn't have lunch, I had breakfast with him. And what else? Rest of whom I met with, I will summarize writing to Kirin. But on the first Monday, which was last Monday, the 5th, there was a conference call, and as there is the first Monday of every month of the regional board chairs. And some of the information that was sent to me following that meeting, I had sent to board members that had to do with the budget change proposals. I'll talk about those tomorrow, because that's going to take a while. During the past couple of months, there's been some phone conversations of a group from the regional board chairs, and we formed a working group to look how to better have a focus on innovation and adapting 21st century technology to help board staff to be more efficient carrying out their work. Some examples of this is an example, and by the way, we've picked stormwater and irrigated lands as what we're going to focus on first. One of the examples that we saw when the regional board chairs met in April, I think Pamela was in that meeting also, was the use of cameras at construction sites, video cameras at construction sites, so that staff could check on the adequacy, if you will, of control measures to prevent stormwater runoff.
Dr. Longley,
Yes.
they keep adjective or description you left out of there was permanently installed video cameras, so they would have 24-hour surveillance.
Exactly. So this gives 24-hour surveillance. You can keep a record of it, and we have a lot of construction sites. A day like today, it's conceivable the soil's still pretty well saturated. It's conceivable you could get runoff, and if someone thinks summer's here and has pulled down the control measures, we could have some significant events happening at many sites, and we just don't have the staff to do the kind of inspection that we should be doing if we had the staff and funding to do it. The cameras may be the answer to that. That's one example. Focus on drones, and another one was find what this is here. Remote sensing for water quality parameters using improved sensors and once again drones or satellites for that. And then another focus in addition to those two areas is through all of this is data analysis, the QA/QC and a single portal display of data. I know that's ongoing in a number of different sectors, but it seems that we never quite get to where we think we should be on that. And so the chairs have picked these as items that they're focusing on. We're meeting in September. We'll continue our conversations by telephone and at WQCC in October, but we're meeting in September at Scripps Lab and pulling in some other folks in that. So it's an interesting venture that we're on, and we'll see where it takes us. Certainly, some ideas are coming out of this that can move us into the 21st century. With that said, we'll move on to agenda item number 4. Thank you. I have a card from Jeff Scharf. And by the way, Jeff gave me some information this morning that really has nothing to do with board business, but Jeff is now becoming a part of being part of the Mooney world. Mooney is an aircraft. I own one. Jeff is going to be a Mooney pilot. So congratulations, Jeff.
Thank you, Carl. Mr. Chairman, board members, thank you. Good morning. I'm Jeff Scharf. I'm here today on behalf of and at the request of Marilyn Wardlow. I've told you before about a Shell station site here in Sacramento that we've been working with your board staff on. And when I was here last, it was to express some concern about further delays, elevated concentrations, and ask for some assistance, which we received. I want to commend, first of all, your staff with Stuart Black, Steve Meeks, and Brad Sheldon. They've been extremely responsive and have been very helpful. Their assistance has been invaluable as we've worked to move forward with Shell, with the consultants. It's a complicated site. We have adjacent sites with potential co-contributors to the contamination. Things are moving forward, and in a large measure, it's a result of my coming before you, bringing this to your attention, and in turn, working with the staff. Ms. Wardlow would have been here herself to say thank you in person. Unfortunately, by her words, her husband's not doing well. And she said, in my absence, please come back to the board and thank all of them for their response to our request for help and assistance, and she appreciates it. So on behalf of Ms. Wardlow, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That's good information. Thank you. As was mentioned earlier, Tam Dudek, State Board member, is not with us this morning. I believe she may be at tomorrow's meeting. Go to agenda item number 6, Executive Officer's Report. Any comments on the report? Once again, a lot of good work taking place. The budget seems to be pretty much tracking.
Yes.
I have no other comments other than praise for those who do all that good work.
Thank you, Dr. Longley. I do have 3 awards to give this morning.
Certainly.
I didn't put this in the EO report, but I should have notified the board. I'm sure you've heard, Tom Howard, the executive director of the state board, has retired. May 31st was his last day. He's gone. Michael Loffer, who did not apply for that position, is acting until they name a replacement for Tom, which we hope will be soon. So they're doing their due diligence, according to Felicia Marcus, on the selection of the replacement. So
I think I have only rumor, but
I don't like rumors.
they're down to a few candidates, and they've been discussing those candidates for a long time, several weeks now.
Yeah. Well, I wish them the best.
I do too.
You guys will be there in a few months doing the same.
What was that?
So I'm just,
I
I'm
heard you had a
jealous
change
of
of
Tom.
plans. I heard you had a change of plans.
No.
It was a year, now it's months, pretty soon it's gonna be weeks.
Yeah, it's down
and
to
then
352 days,
She's not counting. She's not counting.
but I'm not counting. So let me do the awards. Thank you.
Certainly.
So thank you. So this first award goes to Dr. Tessa Fauget. She's an environmental scientist in the Sacramento office, and you'll be seeing her later on today. But she's been the lead staff for the development of the pyrethroid pesticide control program in TMDL. The project is controversial and challenging, as well as a priority for the 2014 Delta Strategic Plan. Tessa successfully advanced this project through scientific peer review and public review. Throughout its development, she has actively engaged diverse technical experts, stakeholders, and agencies to craft a control program that is technically sound, protective of water quality, feasible, and reasonable. During this process, Tessa has provided clear, accurate, and understandable presentations of complex technical and regulatory issues to both stakeholders and the board. She is always ready to listen and is willing to incorporate constructive comments into the proposed project to ensure a balanced and robust product. I guess we should have kept this one for tomorrow, but so it would be after the fact. But Tessa's knowledge on pesticides, water quality criteria, chemistry, and toxicity testing is invaluable to the water boards. She successfully manages contracts for criteria derivation and pesticide monitoring, and provides valuable input to the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program's Pesticide Evaluation Advisory Work Group and the Delta's Regional Monitoring Program's Technical Advisory Committee. Tessa promotes a productive and professional team atmosphere, easily adapts to challenges and changes, and can always be counted on for an objective and independent assessment. And for that and much more, she's being recognized with this Superior Accomplishment Award. So this next award is for Dean Hubbard, an engineer and geologist in our Fresno office. Dean has worked in the regional board office as an engineering geologist for almost 20 years. He is currently in one of the oil fields unit, is primarily tasked with evaluating documents associated with the oil well stimulations or hydraulic fracking related proposals required by Senate Bill or SB 4. During the last quarter, Dean reviewed and critically evaluated over 35 well stimulation treatment applications, 3 groundwater monitoring proposals, and a groundwater monitoring exclusion proposal. He reviews necessary submittals and obtains additional resources of information needed to fully evaluate the SB4 well stimulation submittals. He demonstrates his outstanding geology and hydrogeology knowledge through his preparation of well-written and concise memorandums that document regional board staff reviews. Dean also serves as a mentor to our less experienced staff. His positive attitude, outstanding geologic-related knowledge and skills, field experience, and writing abilities enable him to serve as an excellent role model. And for this and more, he's deserving of this Superior Accomplishment Award. And this next award goes to, I believe, the individual sitting in our sound booth, Gene Coughlin, Staff Information Systems Analyst in the Sacramento office. Come on out, Gene. Gene Coughlin technically works for the State Water Resources Control Board Division of Information Technology. Come on over. However, he is a major part of the support team for the Region 5 Rancho Cordova office. Gene was called upon to assist in the developing a new and innovative approach of presenting the 16-17 fiscal year board's accomplishments in a video format. Gene's willingness and enthusiasm to help bring this vision to life was extraordinary. Equipped with his iPhone video camera and a simple editing program, Gene led the charge. He coordinated the project by working individually with each of our 18 program managers, which was not an easy task, situated in 3 offices throughout the region. He offered each manager direction, creative ideas, supportive feedback, solutions, and above all, patience to create the first video presentation for the board. The presentation was a success. The video will continue to serve as an outreach tool for the public and other interested parties. It is available in its entirety on our website, and the individual segments for each program are separately posted to the program's link on our website. Gene's sensitivity, diligence, energy, and sense of humor made working with him on this project a joy. Gene's work on this project was outstanding and above and beyond his daily tasks for our region. And so for that, he's being awarded the Superior Accomplishment Award.
So the lesson here is if you put together a project that allows Pamela not to do a 2-hour presentation, you get a special award.
Very special award, yes.
And it's considered a superior accomplishment.
That's it, Dr. Longley, unless you have any other questions. That's my report.
Yes, are there any questions pertaining to the report? I see none. We will possibly bring it up tomorrow. Moving on to agenda item 7. Good. This is amendment to the Basin Plan for Control of Pyrethroid Pesticide Discharges. This is the time and place for hearing to consider a resolution amending the water quality control plan for the Sacramento River and San Joaquin River basins that would establish a control program in TMDL to address pyrethroid pesticides. The board conducted a hearing to receive oral comments regarding the proposed basin plan amendment on February 24th, 2017. And we are continuing that hearing today. Is there anyone present who is contesting the proposed actions and wishes to present evidence or testimony on this matter? Is there a hand in the back? No, we'll go ahead and go through the, since there are persons present wishing to contest this item, we'll proceed with the hearing. Yes, we will be taking public comment. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and meeting procedures published with the meeting agenda. At this time, evidence should be introduced on whether the proposed action should be taken. Following the staff presentation, interested persons may speak for 3 minutes each, and a timer will be used. Please state your name, address, and affiliation before speaking. Does council have any legal issues to discuss at this time?
Not at this time.
Thank you, Andrew. We'll now begin with the staff presentation.
Good morning, Chair Longley and board members. My name is Tessa Foget, and I'm an environmental scientist in the pesticide TMDL unit. And today we will be holding a hearing to consider adoption of the proposed basin plan amendment for the control of pyrethroid pesticide discharges. This hearing will begin with a staff presentation, and I'll summarize the proposed basin plan amendment, which would apply to the Sacramento and San Joaquin River watersheds shown on the map. Next, I will summarize the comments received from the public, staff responses to those comments, and the resulting revisions made to the proposal. The key components of the proposed amendment have not changed, but clarification was added to several areas. Following the staff presentation, we will hear any additional oral comments from the public, and staff will provide responses to those comments. Finally, we will request that the board adopt the proposed amendment. Here is a brief background on pyrethroids. Pyrethroids are commonly used pesticides in agriculture as well as urban areas. The main sources to surface waters are urban stormwater runoff and agricultural runoff. Municipal wastewater effluents are also a source. Pyrethroids are a concern in water and sediments because they are toxic to aquatic organisms at very low concentrations, in the parts per trillion. This proposed amendment is focused on 6 pyrethroids identified as priorities because they have the highest use of all pyrethroids in the project area, and they have all been associated with water quality impairments. The overall goal of the project is to establish clear requirements for the control of pyrethroids that provide reasonable protection to beneficial uses in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins. The first project objective is to establish measurable pyrethroid concentration goals to provide reasonable protection of beneficial uses. The second objective is to address existing impairments, specifically referring to the pyrethroid impairments on the 303D list. And the third objective is to develop reasonable and attainable implementation provisions to achieve the concentration goals. Additional project objectives that are forward-looking are an efficient process to address future impairments, provisions for addressing alternative and replacement pesticides that people may shift to, and to meet all of these objectives, we have developed a phased and comprehensive program that would significantly improve water quality by leading to reduced pyrethroid levels in surface waters. A phased approach is needed for this program with monitoring and data gathering because there are several areas of uncertainty, and adaptive management will be needed, and it will also avoid unintended regulatory consequences. This is a brief overview of the proposed pyrethroid control program. There are 4 main components of this approach. The first component is addressing impaired waters through total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, and integrated report category 4B demonstrations. TMDLs would address 9 impairments in in urban water bodies and would only apply to MS4s. Category 4B demonstrations would use our existing irrigated lands regulatory program requirements to address impairments in 5 agricultural waters as an alternative to TMDLs. The second component is a conditional prohibition of pyrethroid discharges to water bodies with aquatic life beneficial uses. The prohibition is aimed at preventing future impairments throughout the basin. And these 2 components are 2 separate tracks, so one for already identified impaired waters and one for preventing impairments in waters. The next component is monitoring and data gathering to inform the board's future actions, which would be required in some form on both tracks. And the final component is coordination with recommendations for the Department of Pesticide Regulation and U.S. EPA Office of Pesticide Programs, which are the agencies that regulate pesticide use. In the February hearing, I spent a lot of time discussing how we landed on the 5th percentile UC Davis criteria, adjusted for bioavailability and additive toxicity, as the proposed concentration goals. The adjustment for bioavailability is a calculation of the dissolved concentration using the dissolved and particulate organic carbon concentrations at, as translators called partition coefficients. And if multiple pyrethroids are present in a sample, they are added together because they have the same mechanism of toxicity. In developing the amendment, we had considered lower concentration goals, the first or 2.5 percentiles, but after considering many factors, we recommended the 5th percentile as providing reasonable protection of beneficial uses. The concentration goals are proposed for use as TMDL numeric targets and as prohibition triggers. The triggers apply at the point of discharge and apply to all discharges to water bodies with warm or cold beneficial uses, which encompasses many waters in the basin.
Can you discuss, going back to the first point on the 5th percentile, could you discuss our ability to detect these? In other words, the analytical methods that are available, their detection limits, quantitation limits, and so forth? Or do you cover that later in your presentation?
I can talk on that now.
Okay.
So the current lab reporting limits are very close, some slightly below the 5th percentile values. So if the lower values, the first or 2.5 percentile, the lab reporting limits would, in I think all cases, be slightly above those values.
Thank you.
Yeah. So next, I'll give a summary of the requirements under the proposed amendment. Monitoring for several constituents would be required, including pyrethroid concentrations, dissolved and particulate organic carbon, which are used in the bioavailability calculations, and toxicity testing with Hyalella azteca in water and or sediment. Where there are existing impairments or monitoring indicates that pyrethroids are above the concentration goals, dischargers would be required to develop management plans. And following that, they would implement management practices to reduce pyrethroid levels in their discharges. The proposed amendment also includes obligations for regional board staff, such as updating the board, reviewing management plans and monitoring results, and continuing to work with DPR and EPA on pesticide issues. There are also recommendations for DPR and US EPA in the proposed amendment to continue working on pesticide issues in order to prevent future impairments by the legal use of registered products. The milestones for dischargers to, this is a timeline of the milestones for the pyrethroids control program. And the milestones for dischargers to impaired waters are on top in orange, and the milestones for dischargers that fall under the conditional prohibition are in the bottom in yellow. And like I said, these are kind of 2 separate tracks, and a discharger would only follow one of these tracks.
I don't see that on this side.
I'll get there. Yeah. So for dischargers to waters that we have already identified as impaired by pyrethroids, they would be required to develop a management plan in the first year after the amendment is adopted. And then following that, they would implement their plan, conduct monitoring, and submit progress reports to that summarize their data, the practices they've implemented, and what they're planning to implement. And this is an iterative, adaptive management approach that should lead to progress over the timeline. There's a 20-year timeline for attaining water quality standards in the impaired waters. So for dischargers that fall under the conditional prohibition, the process starts with baseline monitoring to determine whether pyrethroids may be exceeding the concentration goals. And MS4s, ag dischargers, and POTWs would all be represented in baseline monitoring. They would have 2 years to complete baseline monitoring, and following that, if pyrethroids are exceeding the concentration goals, then those dischargers would have 1 year to develop a management plan. If baseline monitoring shows that the concentration goals are exceeded, or are not exceeded, then there are no further requirements, unless future monitoring indicates otherwise. At 3 years after adoption of the amendment, the conditional prohibition would be in effect. Then dischargers who were above the triggers would begin the iterative adaptive management program of implementing their management plans, monitoring, submitting progress reports, and adapting as needed to continue to reduce pyrethroid levels in their discharges. The board and staff also have a timeline. Staff will be updating the board on the status of the pyrethroid control program every 3 years as part of the triennial review, or more often if requested. And these updates will inform the board of any progress achieved with the control program and provide information regarding any recommended changes when the board revisits the entire program in 15 years. The 15-year timeline is proposed so that there is enough time for dischargers to implement practices and hopefully see results, so the board has enough information to base any changes, as well as to be several years prior to the deadline for attaining water quality standards in the impaired waters, so that any needed changes can be made to ensure that deadline is met. And what makes this a phased approach is that staff are proposing that board commit to reviewing the pyrethroids control program in no later than 15 years after the amendment is effective. This review would include all aspects of the program, such as implementation provisions, monitoring requirements, and the concentration goals. One of the original goals for pyrethroids was to adopt water quality objectives, but we found that we had insufficient information regarding attainability and the costs of attaining that objectives to evaluate according to Porter Cologne requirements. So data collected in the first phase will be used in order to do the thorough analysis of attainability and costs of attainment that is required when considering the adoption of water quality objectives. And I just want to point out that in the development of the proposed amendment, the draft staff report and proposed amendment underwent independent scientific peer review in May of 2015. And we have also prepared substitute environmental documentation in accordance with the California Environmental Quality Act and prepared cost analysis of what we know would be the required and an anti-degradation analysis. This concludes the summary of the proposed amendment, and I can pause here if there are any questions on the overall proposal.
Questions from board members? Go ahead, please.
So next I will move on to public comments and responses. The public comment period began in January when the draft staff report and proposed amendment were released. In February, we conducted a public hearing and received oral comments from 8 stakeholders. Written comments were due March 24th after a 1-week extension, and we received 14 written comment letters. During the public hearing held on February 24th, 8 members of the public provided oral comments on the draft proposed amendment and staff report. Comments were received from stakeholders representing a variety of organizations, including pesticide manufacturers, dischargers, academia, and agencies. Written comments were received from 14 commenters, including 5 of the stakeholders that provided oral comments. Other commenters included agencies, dischargers, environmental groups, and others. Written comments also included 2 letters representing multiple groups, one representing 5 environmental and fisheries organizations, and one representing 11 agricultural groups. The response to comments were divided into broad issues and specific comments. 4 broad issues were identified for which multiple comments were received. For these broad issues, the multiple comments were summarized together and a single response is given from staff. And I will summarize these comments and proposed responses. There were 157 specific comments that were received in total, and I will highlight a few key comments and proposed responses. The response to comment document contains responses to all of the comments received. Some of the specific comments pointed out typos or errors, and these were all corrected in the proposed amendment and staff report. Requests for edits to the proposed amendment for clarity or for minor additions were accommodated in most cases. So for the broad issues, there were 4 commenters expressed a number of related concerns with the proposed bioavailability approach. The concerns with the bioavailability approach expressed were significant variability in the partition coefficients used to calculate the freely dissolved pyrethroid concentration, uncertainty in how representative the freely dissolved concentration is of the actual bioavailable concentration, potential underestimation of effects of sediment-bound pyrethroids for species that ingest sediment particles and for sensitive life stages of fish, and the fact that this bioavailability approach has not been used before in TMDLs or setting levels intended to be protective of beneficial uses. In response, the proposed bioavailability approach is recommended in the UC Davis method because the science indicates that bound pyrethroids are less bioavailable. We used the best available technical information for the proposed bioavailability approach, and the approach was supported by the peer reviewers, and the recommended partition coefficients were chosen because they were determined using the best techniques to obtain accurate values. We agree that more information would likely improve the accuracy of the estimates of the bioavailable concentrations, and that may be incorporated when the control program is revisited or sooner at the request of the board. The next issue, 4 commenters, including both POTWs and MS4s, requested that the pyrethroid triggers be applied to ambient receiving waters rather than directly to discharges, or to be able to use representative receiving water monitoring rather than being required to directly monitor discharges. Reasons for this request included that the pyrethroid trigger values are intended to be protective of aquatic life beneficial uses, which apply to surface waters, and for wastewater dischargers to be able to apply mixing zones or dilution credits. In response, we did not agree with this request, and the recommended approach applies the conditional prohibition to discharges rather than the receiving water for several reasons. The regulatory tool we are using is a prohibition of discharge, and the Water Code authorizes prohibitions on discharges of waste. A prohibition of discharge was the regulatory tool recommended by staff and stakeholders after considering many options, such as adopting water quality objectives. Water quality objectives would legally apply to receiving waters, but this approach was not recommended because of a number of factors, including insufficient information to analyze attainability and costs, as well as unintended regulatory consequences, particularly for wastewater dischargers. In addition, the Pyrethroids Control Program is focused on source control, and having the triggers applied to the discharge makes the link between detected pyrethroids and individual dischargers. We did want to address these concerns around this issue where we could, so one change was to add a provision stating that management plans should be commensurate with the potential impact in receiving water. So effects on beneficial uses in receiving waters will be considered when determining the appropriate level of implementation of management practices. We also changed the monitoring for stormwater to be representative receiving water monitoring to be consistent with their existing regulatory program. The prohibition would legally apply at the discharge, but for practical reasons, representative receiving water monitoring would be used for irrigated agriculture and municipal stormwater because it's consistent with those existing regulatory programs. In contrast, wastewater discharges consist of a small number of discrete point sources, and it is practical to monitor discharges directly. The third broad issue, 3 commenters commented that the 5th percentile concentration goals may not be adequately protective of beneficial uses and recommended that either the 1st or 2.5 percentile UC Davis criteria be used as the concentration goals. The reasons for requesting lower concentration goals included concerns regarding the additive and synergistic impacts of pyrethroids and other stressors on threatened and endangered species and commercial fisheries, particularly in the Delta, increased pyrethroid toxicity at lower temperatures, and the potential for adverse effects to sensitive species at the 5th percentile. In response, staff evaluated each of these issues brought up by the commenters, and these considerations all went into the final recommendation of the 5th percentile criteria as the concentration goals. So additive toxicity is included among the 6 pyrethroids, but there was insufficient information to account for mixture effects with other stressors. Toxic effects were examined for endangered species, but all were above the 5th percentile values. And there was insufficient information to quantitatively account for the temperature effects. And finally, the 5th percentile chronic concentration goals are lower than, or in one case, equal to the LC50 for Hyalella azteca, which was the most sensitive test species identified in all of the data sets, indicating these values do provide reasonable protection, even for sensitive species.
Let me ask a question. If it is, after the monitoring's going on, if it is determined that temperature is a significant factor and should be considered, it's built into the program that can be reconsidered?
Yeah, I mean, at any, that's why we're providing regular updates to the board, and the board could direct staff at any time to work on incorporating that in.
Okay.
There, in fact, are a number of unknowns that really are going to take research to develop, and I would suspect that we will see this back at a point in time when, I think, as you've indicated, when more information is available, when we have something concrete to work on. The data sets are not large either. And this, of course, will create, I think, as we go down the road, more information of really what's out there in the discharges that we're regulating off of this, and receiving water quality also. So, getting this off the ground is important, and I commend the staff for fashioning a program around the best available information we have, rather than venturing off into, heard my earlier question, trying to regulate something that you can't measure is pretty difficult. Yeah. And I do commend staff for the job they've done.
Yeah, and I guess my question was more of, I know that we have regular updates planned, when you say, we'll see you again in 5 years or 6 years, it just seems like a really long time. I know that the board can request to see this earlier. So I guess I would just want to make sure that staff would just keep in mind the concern or the importance of this program. So if there was something that was learned that was significant, that the board could be alerted and then decide whether or not this is something we want to revisit before the scheduled review.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you.
So if any information on the identified data caps becomes available, we should alert the board when that information is available. Yeah. Thank you. The fourth broad issue, 7 commenters had concerns regarding the availability of multiple labs to perform pyrethroid analyses and water column and sediment toxicity testing with Hylela Azteca. There were also concerns about the need for standardized or harmonized protocols for these analyses. In response, we agree that adequate laboratory capacity and standardized protocols will be necessary to ensure reliable data to support the proposed amendment. We have begun engaging with state board staff in the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, or ELAP, and the Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program, or SWAMP, in order to ensure that there will be reliable methods and protocols for the analyses needed for this basin plan amendment. When feasible, using ELAP accredited labs are recommended for chemical analysis and toxicity testing because ELAP provides evaluation and accreditation of environmental testing laboratories. It gives an extra layer of confidence to these labs and methods, but it is not required to obtain quality data. Currently, ELAP can only accredit labs for standardized methods, which unfortunately are not available for the 6 pyrethroids included in this amendment. However, in the future, they will be transitioning their program to be able to accredit for non-standardized methods. When standardized methods are not available, other methods may be used. This is what has been done and continues to be done in our region and other regions that require pyrethroids monitoring. This includes our irrigated agriculture program, which monitors for pyrethroids in sediment when sediment toxicity is identified. Water column pyrethroid monitoring is required under Region 2's MS4 permit and also some of Region 3's MS4 permits. And there's also other pyrethroid monitoring in other regions in the state. So pyrethroids analysis is currently available from multiple commercial labs, and that is where we expect dischargers to send their samples at this time.
It's available. Are they using the same methodology, or are they using different methodologies?
You know, they may have slightly different protocols, but I think that the ones that I'm aware of they're basically modifying an EPA method, and I believe they are all kind of modifying the same one.
Then I would presume there's some studies been done on interlab comparability of, in other words, they've been given blind samples.
I don't think there has been an interlab calibration for pyrethroids chemical analysis, but that's kind of something where we're working with ELAP and SWAMP to kind of push for something
And in
like that to
particular,
happen.
just following up on what Board Member Ramirez says, I'm particularly interested in seeing where you're going with this ELAP, or method development, I should say. Thank you.
Yep. The executive officer in our proposed amendment would have the discretion to approve the methods. And when approving methods, would consider whether it is ELAP accredited, whether it has undergone scientific peer review or been part of an interlaboratory validation study, or what types of quality assurance and quality control plans are in place, and other factors that can demonstrate that the resulting data will be reliable. And I would also like to point out we have some late revisions on this response to comment because we were incorrectly using the term certified rather than accredited, and we've also revised that term in the resolution and staff report.
So the language we see here should be ELAP, not accredited?
Accredited is
Okay.
correct, yeah.
Accredited is correct, okay.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
had been saying certified earlier. All right, now I'll just cover a few of the key specific comments that led to changes. There were several comments regarding concerns that the cumulative impacts of pyrethroids and various other stressors are not fully accounted for in the proposed control program. And 2 commenters referred to the required cumulative impacts analysis under CEQA. In response, The proposed amendment includes toxicity testing, which will provide information on the potential additive and synergistic impacts of pyrethroids in combination with other stressors, and the overall level of protection being attained. Additive and synergistic effects and food web effects were considered in the staff report. And as I mentioned, additive toxicity is included for among the 6 pyrethroids, but there was insufficient information to account for mixture effects with other stressors. Cumulative impacts under CEQA are measured against the environmental baseline, which is the current physical conditions when the project is initiated. In this case, when this project was initiated, there were documented pyrethroids impairments, and we measure the cumulative impacts against that baseline condition. The proposed amendment does not propose to introduce pyrethroids into these watersheds above and beyond current levels. It's designed to reduce pyrethroid concentrations in these watersheds. Thus, the proposed amendment is not expected to significantly contribute to cumulative impacts. 2 commenters commented on pyrethroid-resistant organisms, particularly that the reduced genetic and biological diversity in pyrethroid-resistant Hyalella may have adverse effects on those populations, and also the potential for genetic alterations in salmon populations that could cause declines in struggling populations. In response, staff is not aware of any studies documenting fitness consequences for resistant Hyalella, but if new information on this topic becomes available, it would be considered by the board in the next phase of the control program. We are also not aware of any documentation of salmon or any other species developing resistance to pyrethroids or genetic alterations caused by pyrethroid exposures. There was a request to clarify what concentrations would be compared to the triggers if particulate and dissolved organic carbon data are not available, which are needed for the bioavailability estimation. The commenter recommended that default particulate and dissolved organic carbon values could be used. So it's very important that high quality data is collected to inform the board in this phased approach, and the DOC and POC data are needed to have a more complete picture of the bioavailability and potential toxicity of pyrethroids in discharges and surface waters. So in response, the proposed monitoring goals have been updated to specify that DOC and POC data are required to ensure those data are collected and can be used for comparing to the triggers in the future. So therefore, default values will not be used. There were several comments requesting that the requirements to monitor for alternative pesticides be removed. The reasons for this request included that it is unreasonable to require dischargers to be responsible for use of alternative pesticides in the future. There would likely be no criteria or objective to compare these data to, that it is open-ended research type monitoring, and that the board already has the authority to request this data, so it's unnecessary to include in the amendment. In response, determining the overall potential impacts of pesticide discharges to water quality is the responsibility of the boards and DPR. However, requiring dischargers to characterize their discharge is both appropriate and necessary to determine if these replacement products are impacting water quality. Ag dischargers already do this as part of their monitoring prioritization process, so this would not be a new requirement for them. The board, DPR, and US EPA would coordinate with dischargers to assess which alternative pesticides could be of concern in their discharges based on readily available information on their uses, and followed by the development of any needed specific pesticide monitoring requirements based on that assessment. So this monitoring requirement is consistent with the board's legal responsibilities and regulatory authorities and will help prevent future water quality impairments by other pesticides. there were several comments stating that the toxicity testing requirements were unclear for POTWs, or the wastewater facilities, and that the cost estimates for monitoring for POTWs did not seem to match the monitoring requirements. In response, first, there was an error in the staff report in that toxicity testing was inadvertently left out of the cost estimate for POTWs, which is what caused some of the confusion. And this cost estimate in the staff report was updated to include water column toxicity testing for POTWs. The monitoring requirements in the proposed amendment were also clarified to specify that water column toxicity testing with Hyalela would be required, which was not as clearly spelled out in the earlier draft. In addition, more guidance and information was added to the staff report regarding the use of the EPA method for toxicity testing, as well as swamp guidance.
So, quick question. So, on that slide, excuse me, what I just heard was there was a comment that they didn't match, and we updated the numbers so that they matched, but it was higher. Was there a follow-up? I mean, our response can't just be that we updated it and it was higher. Was there a feedback loop after that that update with the POTWs?
Adam?
Have we heard from
we,
them?
I mean, we have had several
Yeah, this is Jean
formal
Chilcott,
discussions.
Program Manager of Planning. We have been in discussions with the dischargers as we've been going through these reviews and the response to comments. Specifically identifying a number with the POTWs, I don't think that we had that specific of a feedback, but we did identify for them that we had inadvertently left out that component, which they were aware of.
So so you had the conversation about what it's going to cost, and they understand that at this point.
We never had a specific meeting on the additional costs. It was only in the response to comments and the updated staff report that was released.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so there was a request that the baseline monitoring for POTWs be timed to be concurrent with effluent characterization monitoring requirements rather than within 2 years following approval of the proposed amendment. In response, we agreed with this comment because POTWs are likely the smallest identified contributor of pyrethroids compared to other sources, and many of our POTWs have relatively small discharges. So the proposed amendment was changed to reflect this. So the timeline I showed earlier would be a little different for POTWs because their baseline monitoring under the prohibition would be staggered with permit renewals instead of all occurring within 2 years of the amendment being adopted. There was also a request to exempt very small POTWs, less than 1 million gallon per day discharge, from monitoring requirements and reduce monitoring requirements for small POTWs. In response, we agree that very small POTWs should be exempted from monitoring requirements, and the proposed amendment was updated to reflect this change. Small POTWs would not be exempted from the monitoring, but I would like to point out that monitoring requirements would be relative to the size of the discharge and potential impacts. So, in addition, there are various options that are available to all dischargers to reduce the economic impacts if appropriate. So these options include representative monitoring, so a group of dischargers could collaborate and share the costs to fulfill the monitoring requirements. The monitoring requirements may be discontinued by the executive officer, so pyrethroids monitoring may not be a long-term cost. In particular, the trend monitoring would be commensurate with the potential impact of the discharge, and facilities may request reduced trend monitoring based on their baseline monitoring results. So now I just want to highlight the areas of the proposed amendment and staff report where changes were made from the January draft in response to the comments and for clarity. So there were additions to the prohibition of discharge in the proposed amendment to clarify that management plans should be commensurate with the potential impact of the discharge, and also that multiple entities can submit a joint management plan. For example, an MS4 and a POTW with overlapping service areas could work together on a management plan. Another change in the proposed amendment is frequency of progress reporting for POTWs was changed from annually to midterm and end term of their 5-year permit term, which makes it consistent with the progress reporting for MS4s also. Most of the changes to the proposed control program were in the surveillance and monitoring requirements. The general monitoring information that applies to all dischargers was reorganized to repeat less of it, and information was added to clarify that the regional board will seek to work through existing regulatory programs to obtain the monitoring data, but may also issue 13267 or 13383 orders if needed to meet the timelines of the program. Clarifications were added to specify the minimum information that should be in a monitoring plan and how the executive officer will determine if a proposed method is appropriate. In the monitoring provisions, text was added to specify what data is required, for example, as I mentioned, the particulate and dissolved organic carbon. And I already mentioned that representative receiving water monitoring would be used for urban stormwater, and that POTWs would complete their baseline monitoring timed with their permit renewals and effluent characterization monitoring. The changes to the staff report somewhat mirror those in the proposed amendment. There were additions and clarifications in the surveillance and monitoring chapter to add guidance on methods for sample collection and handling, chemical analysis, and toxicity testing. We also added clarification on when data would be compared to the acute or chronic triggers, considering that most samples will be grab samples. There were updates to the cost estimates for POTWs, as I mentioned, as well as MS4s and ag dischargers to include water column toxicity testing. The ag cost estimates were further updated based on a more detailed estimate of the number of sites that would be monitored throughout the entire region. And finally, 2 appendices were added to the staff report. Appendix D was added to respond to a request from US EPA for clarifications to the TMDL, particularly to make things clear for permit writers in the future. So Appendix D documents all NPDES permittees in the TMDL watersheds and specifies whether or not they should have waste load allocations in their permit. And Appendix E documents completed management plans for pyrethroids from the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. As I start to wrap up, I want to show the overall project timeline, starting with CEQA scoping in 2012. Since then, we held 9 stakeholder meetings and had 3 board workshops in 2016 as we were developing the proposed amendment. The draft staff report and the proposed basin plan amendment were released in January. We held a comment hearing in February to receive oral comments, and written comments on the amendment and accompanying staff report were due in March. The next steps for the proposed pyrethroids basin plan amendment begins with board considering adoption today. If it is adopted, then it will go to state board for review and approval, likely by December, followed by Office of Administrative Law approval, and then US EPA review and approval, possibly by next June. After that, monitoring and implementation would begin, and staff would update the board at least every 3 years. The board would revisit the control program in no more than 15 years, and attainment of standards in the impaired waters would be required in no longer than 20 years. To conclude, the proposed approach meets the overall goal of establishing clear requirements for the control of pyrethroid discharges to provide reasonable protection of beneficial uses in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River watersheds. The proposed approach would address our current impairments and put a comprehensive framework in place to prevent future 303D listings. It also meets the identified need of a phased approach with implementation based on management practices and source control, and data gathering to inform the board's future decisions. The use of a conditional prohibition rather than numeric water quality objectives avoids unintended consequences while still protecting beneficial uses. There's some uncertainty in this approach, particularly in the extent of management practices that would need to be implemented to reduce pyrethroid levels below the triggers. This approach requires follow-up, so the board would continue to be updated on the controlled program for years to come. The proposed amendment was developed with significant stakeholder input, and we have responded to all comments we received and revised the proposed amendment where appropriate. So with that, staff recommends that the board adopt the resolution and proposed amendments for the control of pyrethroid discharges, including the late revisions I mentioned. So this concludes the staff presentation, and next we will hear public testimony, and the board will consider approval of the resolution.
Any comments or questions by board members? Yes, John?
Hopefully this is an easy question. So a couple slides ago, it laid out the timeline and it said that compliance was required in 20 years. I'd like staff's opinion as to the probability that we're going to get there. Are we reaching and hoping, or is this something that we think is really going to happen? And that's sort of a trick question, but hopefully it's an easy answer.
The easy answer is yes. The reason for the yes is we're talking about currently impaired water bodies, so we do have a focus on those. We do have management plans that are in progress. We think that there will be improvement over time based on the management practices in place. There's always a question mark, but we do feel that the 20-year gives us time to adapt, because we will be having those 3-year reviews, and we'll also be having the revision and the overall reevaluation of the control program 5 years before that 20-year timeline.
And I only asked the question the way I asked it because everything that's presented, there's sort of an underlying assumption that staff has to use their judgment that this is actually going to work, but nowhere in the presentation is it noted that you think it's going to work. So I just wanted to make sure I asked that question.
I guess I didn't ask that question because I was around for a good part of the rice pesticide program. There was some uncertainty when it started, but it was a huge success. I've seen that it can happen. Are there any further questions or comments?
And Dr. Longley, can I just
Certainly.
respond to that also?
Go ahead, Adam.
We actually have added a appendix or an attachment to the staff report that shows areas on the ag program where we feel we have addressed these issues in our current irrigated lands program and solved problems based on sediment toxicity from pyrethroids.
I think that was Appendix D, yes, and that's a very good point. We've had success already, so.
I would like to point out, though, and we do anticipate, but we still have for the MS4s, that's a little more difficult to assess. And so the board's committed to continuing to work with EPA and DPR on their registration requirements on this. We'd like to try and figure out how they can best implement and put label restrictions on it so that we can address the MS4 issue as well.
Thank you. Before we take public testimony, we're going to have a short recess, but before we do that, I'd like to point out that at the beginning of this beginning of your presentation, Tam Dudick, State Board member, joined us. Tam, we're happy to have you. Thank you very much, and it's now, please be back here at 20 to the hour. It now shows 28 after. The board is back in session on item 7. Please take your seat.
Dr. Longley?
Yes, Mr. Laputz, please.
Yes.
I'm sorry,
I,
Adam. Adam, please.
I inadvertently had, when pulling together hearing procedures, left out the oath on this item. Staff did not need to take the oath because when we opened the hearing, they already took the oath. But for other folks getting up and coming to speak, we need to have that. So if I could direct you to at least one of the other agenda items with that text to go ahead and give that, that would be.
Okay, I would appreciate that. Give me the text you have, please.
Sure.
Faster than me doing that. You know, I thought about that, but then I thought, well, this basin plan, we don't need to do this with this, but we do. Okay. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and meeting procedures published with the meeting agenda. At this time, the evidence should be introduced on whether proposed action should be taken. All persons expecting to testify, please stand at this time, raise your right hand, and take the following oath. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer I do. Thank you very much. Following the staff, okay. And as was pointed out, this is a continuation of the hearing in February, and the staff that have spoken today have already taken the oath, so we're in good shape there.
Chair Longley,
Yes.
I would just like to make a request to enter staff presentation into the record. Forgot to say that
That is
earlier.
accepted. It is part of the record. Thank you. Going to the cards, I have a card from Regina with PCFA, I believe. Is Regina here? The last name is Chick. Okay. I'm sorry, I did not want to go any farther than Regina. Could you pronounce your last name for me, please?
It's Chicazola, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. You can't speak yet, okay? My son Malcolm Chicazola is also here. He might want to say something quickly, but I don't think he understands pyrethroids very well. He's very pro-fish, though. I'm here today speaking on...
And who do you represent, please?
I'm here today. This is Regina Chicazola. My address is P.O. Box 142, Orleans, California, 95556. I'm here today representing the Pacific Coast Federation of Fisheries Association. And I also did comments on behalf of the San Francisco Baykeeper and the California Sports Fishing Protection Alliance, who cannot be here today, and they apologize for that, along with some environmental justice and water safety groups.
Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to say that this is of grave concern to fishermen throughout the state of California, as you guys know, the Bay Delta is in a crisis right now, where our salmon numbers are very low. We are shut down in Northern California completely due to low salmon numbers, and in the Sacramento, the fishing season is very small and limited. We're down from about 500 vessels to around 100, 5,000 to around 1,000, and last year less than 500 boats took in any salmon at all. We believe that this comes from cumulative effects, but in cases of how pyrethroids are affecting the salmon, we're not sure, but we do know that they do affect reproductive success, and that they do affect straying and some other issues. Of course, the science is still being created on this, but as far as the Delta smelt goes, there is no question that pyrethroids are very much impacting the smelt and are somewhat responsible for their demise. Therefore, we believe that we should have a more protective approach to dealing with the pyrethroids than the 5 percentile UC Davis approach. We also don't think that this is the proper place to test out the bioavailability approach because it hasn't been tested before and it's very scientifically controversial. Some of the scientists that even worked on some of the studies it's based on have spoken out against its use. And when it comes to fisheries, sediments is of a grave concern. And the bioavailability approach only looks at what's in the water column and not what the animals are eating and what's in the sediments. So also we feel like the assimilative capacity of these watersheds have been overestimated because of the cumulative effects for multiple pesticides use and also other water quality factors. Obviously, water quality is in really bad shape within these watersheds, and flow is also really low, which leads to less assimilative capacity. So there's about a million other things we could say, but our comment time is almost up. But we would urge the board to take a stronger approach. We think the uncertainties actually show that a stronger approach should be taken. And if you're going to go with the 5th percentile from UC Davis approach, that we don't use the bioavailability approach to this because it only really deals with 10% of the toxins and the sediment is of a great, the sediments are of a great concern in this situation. I mean, it's even been stated that so much of the sediments are deposited in the delta, 30 to 60% that come out of these watersheds, that this is undermining, that not having a stronger approach could undermine the restoration that's been done in the delta because of how much pyrethroids could be deposited in sediments and maybe already are. So I know there's a lot of uncertainty. Thank you so much for you guys' work on this, but we do think there should be a stronger approach. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Any questions?
Yeah, I will follow up a question with staff, but not till after. And I think I understand your point of conservative assumptions and sort of a compounding effect of the different assumptions being used. So thank you, and I think we'll just talk about that a little bit.
Okay, thank you so much for hearing me today and for taking my comments and for considering them throughout this process.
Thank you. Dave Tamayo, Environmental Specialist with Sacramento County Stormwater Program. Okay.
Just say something quick. What do you think of fish?
What?
Okay, that's enough.
No, no, no.
Say something then. You gotta go.
Say.
Okay. Just say save the fish.
Save the fish.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry,
after-
he always has to say something.
And
I'm-
after Dave, we have Paul Bedore, scientist with RBI.
And I'll just say that I'm not sorry that you brought him, and I like to see that, and I think that you're creating good memories. He's going to remember you that way.
Thank you, Chair Longley, and the rest of the board for this opportunity. I wanted to start out by just mentioning that the need for this is pretty clear, that US EPA's risk assessment for pyrethroids as a class of insecticides has recently been released and has indicated that there is significant risk of pyrethroid impacts on the aquatic environment, and in particular, from my point of view, in urban runoff. So wanted to express the county's support for the overall approach for this. We think that in particular, the recognition of the need to coordinate with DPR and US EPA are very important aspects of this, but the other components are also helpful and recognize the practical limitations of what we can do, but also some of the positive things that we are able to accomplish as local agencies. And I wanted to thank staff for the process, and this is probably one of the more important things I want to say. The process worked very well for us. I think we were able to work through a lot of sticky issues. We were able to identify sort of technical glitches that would have made life pretty difficult for us without really improving things. So the process of working through the issues, and it was long and painful, and it was lots and lots of meetings, but I think then in the end we came up with a much better result, and I wanted to commend the board and for management for allowing staff to put the time and energy into that type of process. And I think for other issues in the future, would appreciate similar types of processes where we can really work through some of the issues. Also, I wanted to concur with the award that Tessa Foget got, because she's put a lot of work into that process, and her diligence really made a big difference. Overall, this is something that we think we can live with, that we think will make a difference in the long run, and we urge adoption. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Are there any?
Can
yes.
you please put your name into the record?
Oh, I'm sorry. Dave Tamayo, Sacramento County Stormwater Program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Those were very positive comments. We're glad for the feedback on the job that Tess did. Thank you. Next is Paul Bedore. Thank you. Thank you very much. Linda Dorn, Regional SAN.
So, good morning, Chair Longley, board members. Linda Dorn, Environmental Program Manager with Regional SAN. And I would like to point out that this process has actually been going on longer than the timeline that Tessa showed. It started in 2009, 2010, with the development of criteria for pyrethroids from UC Davis. So we've been in this for a long haul. We have commented and participated since that early date. And I guess the thing that I'd like to bring to the forefront the most is the stakeholder participation that has been allowed in this process. And I think it has got us to this point of not having a lot of conflicts or demands, and appreciate all the work that Tessa.
Hey, Linda.
Oh, speak up?
Okay.
Okay, appreciate all the work that Tessa has done, and Danny and all the regional board staff. We are accepting of the compromise on the receiving water and effluent that was proposed here at the end, and think that we can live with that. I would like to say that for the analytical methods and the toxicity methods, we would encourage that there be interlaboratory studies. So the information that is gathered from those are considered reliable in making determinations and assessment about beneficial uses being met in the Delta. And I think that's the main point that we would like to reemphasize. Also that we do support the 5th percentile, and if I go on, I'm just going to be repeating things that were put in our comment letter and previous oral statements. So thank you, and if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Linda. I like your comments on stakeholders process. You think, God, do I have another meeting to go to? But I think in the end they do pay off. You've certainly been involved not only in this and CV, but CV salts. You have stakeholders all over you on you, but I appreciate your comments on the process, because my experience also, it's the way we get to something that works.
I didn't mention the Delta RMP. Right?
Oh, and the Delta RMP, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Debbie Webster? I might point out, if you go to stakeholder meetings, you meet a lot of nice people, hardworking people. Right, Debbie?
You do. Thank you. Anyways, good morning, Chair Longley and board members. Debbie Webster with the Central Valley Clean Water Association. And I want to just start out, just to let you know, is our community is committed to water quality and making sure that water quality is protected. That's what we do 24/7. And so when I make some of these comments, because we deal in a regulatory environment. I want you to know it's not because of a issue against water quality. It's just is how it gets implemented. But to start with, I really want to start with, again, thanking your staff for initiating the stakeholder process. I think that it was really good. I think that going forth in a kind of BMP or best management approach, especially for POTWs, which always have to deal with things at end of pipe and do things at treatment plants and cost a lot of money and makes very little difference sometimes. That's not the appropriate approach. So we really appreciate that. We appreciate that this is an iterative approach. We also support the 5% at this time, given the amount of knowledge that is there. Regarding some of the recent changes, I also want to say I really appreciate some of those. This break to very small POTWs, very expensive program for them, incredibly impacting, and to provide exclusions for those very small facilities that don't always discharge or discharge just periodically, very important. One other thing that didn't get mentioned during this part is before it was a blanket type of everybody has to develop a management plan whether or not you have a problem or not. That's been changed. Now it is if there's an indication because of monitoring. So it's done when it's appropriate and that you're able to size or to tailor your management plan so that it fits the needs of your water body. Really, really, really do appreciate that. So in my last minute, I actually want to just bring up where we're still concerned, and it really has to do with the monitoring. And a lot of it is just the reliability of it. We have methods that are, I want to say methods, but with Hylela and with some of these new testing, they've been used, they were used at laboratories, and actually the new ELAP, what ELAP is proposing would allow just a single lab to go through, come up with a procedure, get tested on it, and be able to be certified with it without going through interlaboratory comparison, without looking at things over time and space, just to make sure it's reliable in a regulatory use setting to determine, whether you're in compliance, whether or not you need actions, those type of things. And so we really urge that as these processes, as we're looking forward to, as we're implementing this, that things like Hylela, which after being used and used and used, and then finally going through one interlaboratory, I'm going to use an extra 30 seconds if I can.
I give you 29 seconds.
Woohoo! Just came out that, hey, wait a second, there's something wrong here. Tighten things. It came out better, but we haven't tried that over time and space. And that's the same thing with these new, kind of concentration methods. We just want to make sure they're reliable as they're used, and so that when we do take actions or are required to take actions, that they're appropriate and that the response is appropriate. But again, I want to thank you. The process and the time that we've been able to work with staff on these things has been incredibly helpful and has made for a better plan. And we look forward to continue to work with your staff.
Thank you very much. Anyone have questions for Debbie? Thank you. Thank you very much. I have cards now from Department of Fish and Wildlife, Scott Cantrell and Stephen Louie. Stephen's putting himself down as technical support if necessary.
Good morning, Chair Longley and board members. My name is Scott Cantrell. I'm the chief of the water branch in the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. My address is 830 S Street, Sacramento, California, 95811. I appreciate the opportunity to review and comment on the Central Valley Water Board's proposed control plan for pyrethroid pesticide discharges in the Sacramento-San Joaquin River basins. In the Central Valley Bay Delta, threatened and endangered species of fish are declining to historic low levels of abundance, with some species like Delta smelt thought to be very close to extinction. Poor water quality conditions in the Central Valley Bay Delta watershed are one of the factors contributing to deteriorating ecosystem health. Pyrethroid pesticides are currently widely used throughout the Central Valley, and there is ample scientific evidence that the use and discharge of pyrethroid pesticides has adversely impacted aquatic life beneficial uses. Pyrethroid pesticides are extremely toxic to aquatic organisms at very low concentrations. As additional monitoring is conducted, it is predicted that additional water bodies will exhibit impairments due to pyrethroid pesticides. The department supports the adoption of a pyrethroid control program and the use of numeric pyrethroid concentration goals. The department has expressed concerns that the proposed concentration goals may not be protective of sensitive species and that the control program may not address downstream impacts. We believe a robust monitoring program is critical to the control plan to measure its effectiveness. However, the monitoring plan alone will not provide the information needed to address the scientific uncertainties in the control program, including bioavailability and the sublethal effects of pyrethroids. We therefore believe it is important for the regional board to develop a science-based research plan to address and resolve scientific uncertainties and to adaptively manage future updates to the control program. Development of this research plan should be included as a requirement in the basin plan. This research plan should be developed to specifically address the science needed to work towards answering key questions and uncertainties outlined in the regional board staff report. We also recommend that you ask the Delta Science Program to review the draft research plan. The Delta Science Program has conducted many of these types of reviews and has a good reputation of providing independent and unbiased reviews of scientific and regulatory programs. We also believe it is important to allow for stakeholder input on the draft research plan. The department reiterates the importance of regulating pyrethroid pesticides and the phased approach as outlined in the staff report and associated basin plan amendment as a first step. We look forward to working collaboratively with the regional board on the implementation of this critical program. Thank you.
Any comments or by board members? If you would just stand there, Scott. Adam, you and and you, Pamela, and I have discussed this, and you had some additional language to address the that you'd like to introduce to address the request that Scott just made.
Yes, I do, and what I can do is I can bring it up on the computer screen. So and you guys can take a look at it. I've also got some printouts here. So hold on one second. Let me go ahead and pass these out, and we also have printouts available.
Why don't you let Kieran pass those out, and you go ahead and get it up on the screen. Thank you.
Okay, let me see if I can zoom in on this a little bit so you can see the text. But this would go, we've passed out also to you copies of the resolution text. There's an attachment 1 to that resolution. On page 8, starting on page 8 of that attachment 1, there's a set of requirements that would be applicable to the Regional Water Board. And there's right now, currently, there would be 7 of those, and we would be proposing here adding an 8th one. That still really can't see it here on the screen, so let me just, ooh, no, that didn't help at all. So essentially, you'll see, this text would be for us, and what it would do is similar to the comment. It would set us on a path to working on a research plan, working with stakeholders, working with other agencies, but to look for funding for that plan once we have it developed to try and implement it with funding.
And then Scott made the request that this be coordinated with the Delta Science Program. I see that that's part of this.
Yes.
The other thing that I have a concern about is you go down and list the particular areas, starting, I don't know how many lines down. Plan could include potential refinements, a lot of several issues there that are very important. Is there some way that we could get included in that list something on methodology?
Absolutely. We can go ahead and get something in there, and I can present it to you a little later after we've heard a few more public comments, if you'd like that.
I'd like to hear a comment on that. If there's any board member that objects to that, I would like to hear it. Thank you.
So, Carl, when you say methodology, are you referring to the percentile, or are you?
Talking about the procedures themselves, the ELAB stuff, the interlaboratory studies, those kind of things. We just have to improve the methodology.
Is that clear enough to staff?
Right, so the chemical analysis methods and toxicity test methods,
That's right.
particularly doing interlab calibration studies.
But just to be clear, it's not we're not dealing with the policy decision around
Right.
percentile, right?
Yeah, correct.
In this one piece right here.
Correct.
Okay.
It gives us the data so that we can better address that later as a lab. Or gives us the testing process so we can get there. So Scott, is that pretty much satisfy your concerns? Got to push the right buttons around here.
Yes, looking at the proposed language for the resolution, I think it looks really good, and we would support that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, this
And-
gets at the essence of our concern and recommendation.
Great. It's great to hear that. Any other comments? Thank you, sir. And
Sure.
I anticipate that we'll be working very closely with you and your staff in the days, weeks, and years to come.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sure, bye.
Mike Johnson, Davis, California. And no comments? Okay. Tess Dunham and Scott Jackson.
I think we can make this pretty quick. Tess Dunham for the Pyrethroid Working Group. Scott Jackson as well is here if there are any technical questions. Since, us lawyers, we do try to avoid talking about technical stuff, but we don't always help ourselves, do we, Patrick? So anyway, we both wade in occasionally. We want to echo many of the comments that have been provided by other stakeholders that have participated in this process, and again, give our thanks and appreciation to the staff, the transparency of the process, and the working with us over a number of years to address the many issues that have been associated with this control program. And we really appreciate all of that time and effort that the board and the staff has put into this. We, as the Pyrethroid Working Group, as most of you may know, we are the registrants. We are a consortium of the registrants for the pyrethroid pesticides. And we do and are supportive of the approach that's being taken in the control program based upon all the work that we've done over the years. We do believe that the consideration of bioavailability is absolutely appropriate, as well as the use of the 5th percentile. And so we support that approach in the staff recommendation. Appreciate the chance, having looked at the language that was just provided with respect to the research program, and we don't have any major concerns with that, and of course would love to be a stakeholder participating in that. Clearly we have been working on the pyrethroids and researching them for a number of years, and believe that we can be a collaborative partner in the development of the research plan as well as the studies going forward. So thank you all very much, and we encourage your adoption of the control program as being recommended by staff today.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? If not, anybody else wish to speak on this issue? Seeing none, we are ready for a recommendation by the executive officer.
So did you want to add some?
I do have some additional text that I want
That's
to bring
right.
up on the screen.
I forgot about that. You need to give us that.
So I have it ready. Let me just make sure they've got it on there. So one second.
That's the Rocket Launch Center in there.
Okay, let me make sure this is the right version here. I'm sorry, one second. They didn't post the right version. Hold on.
Carl,
Yes, go ahead.
can I ask a question?
Sure, go
At
ahead.
Since we have a break. One question is, in the timeline, it shows EPA approval. Is that true of this plan or review? Or can you explain how EPA, what role they play in this process?
Yes, and I think before that, those are estimated dates based upon experience. Is that correct? Okay.
Sure.
And I think that's a question that's very interesting.
Well, EPA, because it's a basin plan amendment and it's dealing with surface waters, EPA ultimately has to approve our basin plan amendment, especially for it being a TMDL control program. So that's where EPA is involved at the end of the game. They've been involved throughout the whole process, working with our staff on the development of this. We've also been meeting with EPA in San Francisco with Tomas Torres, the director of the water division there for EPA, so that we are making sure that what they want in our program is addressed. And so they are, they like others would like to see the lower number, but they understand the approach and they are agreeable to this approach that we're taking. And they have also looked at the draft of what we were proposed to you today, and they are in agreement with that as well. So EPA has been engaged throughout the whole process.
Thank you. And they provided some very interesting comments, and I saw you reply to their comments, and I understand you had further discussion with them to address their comments.
Just to provide a little more information on that. So US EPA approves the water quality standards part of our basin plan amendment. So they would be approving the TMDLs and things related to water quality standards. So they review parts of the basin plan amendment. Other parts that are outside of the Clean Water Act EPA doesn't have approval authority over.
And just to clarify one additional step, I mean, the Clean Water Act sets up a situation where the states are responsible for water quality standards. That's something that the federal government delegated to the states. So the EPA's role is basically to conduct an independent analysis to determine whether the proposed standards are scientifically defensible, protective of the designated beneficial uses, and consistent with the Clean Water Act. So that's what the staff's engagement with US EPA has been during this process, and basically that's what their final seal of approval means at the end of the day.
Very good.
Like
We're
to add
still
one
looking
more.
for the text.
Danny McClure, Senior Water Resource Control Engineer.
So then, can I ask my other question that I sort of hinted at earlier? Our first speaker mentioned the percentile and the bioavailability, and it seemed to sort of imply that when you compound these two items, you're not as conservative or as protective as you need to be, and I just wanted to have staff respond to that sort of one last time.
Yeah, I can respond to that. She brought up valid concerns that particularly about the bioavailability approach not having been used widely in any regulatory programs. And so actually, I think this revision with this research plan will actually go a long way into kind of helping make sure that is that the values we're using are as accurate as they can be and will be as protective as we want them to be. So I think this revision actually helps kind of speak to a lot of her concerns about the uncertainties by gathering additional data.
Since we're speaking about the speaker number one that came forth, there wasn't the concern about the water quality, but the sediments. And will this research plan that is being proposed, will that help address some of those items as well?
Yes, I think it would. And I guess also too, for sediment concerns, the monitoring program does include sediment toxicity testing. So that is another way we're going to be looking at the sediment.
I wanted to add something too, and this may figure into point 8 that Adam's got up on screen, is can we have some language that talks about the sampling protocol to produce meaningful results? I'm thinking about optimizing temporally, spatially, procedurally to look at that. I don't see a lot of mention. We're dealing with very low levels of constituents over a broad, geographic area. Can we have some research that deals with, how many samples and when? I don't see that in the point. It sort of gets.
That may get to this last, or possibly the last item could be on this right here. Situation laboratory methods with pyrethroid and toxic inter-laboratory comparison. That doesn't quite get where you want to go, Dan.
Yeah, because I look at lots of data. It's sad to see data that's meaningless. I want to see the right data done at the right time to get the most bang for the buck.
Right. So if we put in there consideration of monitoring and laboratory methods, that may get closer to what you're looking for.
Yeah, you're getting there.
The one concern on that is obviously good to be looking at. The one concern that should be considered in putting this is we don't want to have this be something that causes us. We don't want to wait for this to initiate. We might not want to wait for this to initiate all the monitoring that we want to start to happen upon approval of this basin plan amendment. So
I agree. We're trying to do the best we can with what we've got now, but I want to see a movement to be better.
Yep.
Thanks.
So I did add monitoring and laboratory methods to this just now. Is there anything else that I just want to draw your eyes to this is we did use the word could for a couple reasons. We didn't use shall. One of those reasons is because we're concerned how much funding we're going to get, things like that. We may not be able to tackle all these things at once. But on the flip side, it also gives us flexibility to add things to the list also.
Thank you, Adam. Is there any comments, questions on this? If not, are there any, since there are no further questions, board members, I'll go ahead and ask for a recommendation by the executive officer.
So thank you, Dr. Longley, and I would like to thank staff and all the stakeholders and the other agencies that helped us put this together. And it is a difficult thing for the board because we're asking you to adopt a program where we believe it's protective of water quality, but it's going to take some time. So appreciate the patience of the board while we put this together and gather more science and data to see how we can further refine it. So I do recommend adopting it with these late changes to add in this research and plan that will satisfy the Fish and Wildlife so that we can begin to gather that data that we need to adjust some of the uncertainties that may cause us to revise or consider revision of the fifth percentile and help us move towards actually establishing a water quality objective as opposed to a goal in the future. So I recommend approving the plan as proposed with this late change.
Thank you very much. Do during the last, well, I'll close the hearing now and simply say that during the last decade or so, the board has taken on a number of difficult challenges. I think the board really sets an example for how agencies such as ours should approach water quality, ensuring that water quality is protected. Pyrethroids present a very good case of we're dealing in an area where there is not the data that we need. I think particularly with the late revisions, we are showing that we are dedicated to find ways of developing that data so that it allows us to make sharper decisions, if you will. I can't think of a better word, but decisions that are based on science and good data. As part of this, these long drawn-out processes, and I was commenting on it earlier, and that's the stakeholder process. And I have never seen before stakeholder processes like we've had in this century. They take a long time. They take resources from all the folks involved. They have to show up at those meetings, and oftentimes they have to participate by putting money on the table to do work. And it's cumbersome, it's lengthy, but it gets the results that we could not get to otherwise. And I think it's important when we have a shared policy, if you will, where we develop it together. Of course, regional board is always there to tell you that do we have the last word? Maybe. You can always go to court. But we find that the stakeholder process, in fact, does away with judges making decisions so often, and those decisions being made jointly as we work through the process. That's a much better way, in my opinion, to be able to do that. So with that said, is there any further questions or deliberations? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the resolution with amending the basin plan and establishing a TMDL together with the revisions.
That would be with the 2 sets of late revisions, correct?
That would be, yes.
I would move to approve with the 2 late revisions.
Carmen's approved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
John seconded. Call the roll, please.
Ms. Ramirez?
Yes.
Mr. Costantino?
Aye.
Ms. Brower?
Yes.
Dr. Malcolm?
Aye.
Ms. Kadara?
Yes.
Dr. Longley?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you, staff.
No, I'd just like to acknowledge to staff the tremendous amount of work. The stakeholders that spoke talked about the excellent support that was provided by staff. And the good part is that staff not only participates in this process and then stakeholders are at the table, but they do listen. And I think that's a result of some of the amendments that have come forth. And we're not able to please everybody with what we're doing, but our major focus is to address water quality, and I think we're moving in a positive direction with the program that has come forward. So thank you, staff. Thank you for all the stakeholders that participated in the process and for all the comments that were made.
And I join Denise in those thanks. We're going to move to agenda item 8. How much time is estimated for this item? Looking at the clock.
Sure. Longley, we have an item for Linda County that is uncontested now, and we have people in the audience. Could we just move that ahead so that we can allow them to go home?
That's agenda item
That's agenda item number 10.
10.
And then number 8, I would estimate that one's at least an hour.
Well, we can always start and come back to it after we go for lunch. Okay. We'll move on to agenda item 10, consideration of MPDS permit for Linda County Water District wastewater treatment plant, Yuba and Sutter counties This is the time and place for hearing to consider renewal of the MPDS permit for the Linda County Water District wastewater treatment plant in Yuba and Sutter counties. Is there anyone present who is contesting the proposed action and wishes to present evidence or testimony on this matter? If so, if you're here and wish to talk on this matter, please stand up so I can acknowledge your presence. Seeing no one present to contest this matter, the board will proceed based on the agenda materials on the record. Are there any late revisions or staff comments?
Good morning, Dr. Longley and members of the board. My name is Nicole Morgan, supervising engineer here in the Sacramento office. There are late revisions. The revisions are to add pH compliance determination language and to clarify the required pH sampling frequency in the permit. The discharger has seen these proposed late revisions and is in agreement with them.
And these have been discussed with the discharger?
Yes, they have.
And acknowledged by them. Thank you. Does council have any legal issues to discuss at this time?
Not at this time.
Thank you. Hearing is now closed. The chair will entertain a motion to renew the MPDS permit.
I would move to renew the NPDES permit as proposed with the late revisions.
I'll second.
Been moved and seconded. Call the roll, please.
Ms. Ramirez, Mr. Costantino, Ms. Brar, Mr. Schneider, Dr. Markham,
Aye.
Ms. Kadara,
Yes.
Dr. Longley.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you very much. Moving on to agenda item 8. And as I said, we'll run this till around 12 o'clock. We'll take a break for lunch and come back.
So Dr. Longley,
Yes.
This is an information item. I don't know if it's really conducive to a break. So we can either, because we have, it's not just staff presentation and questions and answers. It's the dischargers who.
What about number 10? I mean, number 11.
The bovine order? The enforcement update, I think, Andrew could take that, and it would be about 30 minutes.
Good.
As long as you don't have a lot of questions, if you have a lot of questions. I can't control you guys.
I only have one question in 27 parts.
Subdivided further. At this time, the board will hear the annual enforcement update for the Central Valley region. This is information item only, and no action will be taken, although the board may ask questions, many questions, and provide direction to staff. We'll now hear the staff presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Longley and members of the board. I'm Andrew Altavogt, and Assistant Executive Officer in the Rancho Cordova office. So I'm here today to provide an enforcement update, and this enforcement update covers mostly activities over calendar year 2016. In summary, there are a number of topics I wanted to talk about today. The first is just a review of our enforcement policies and the tools and the processes that we use. I'll also be talking about some of our compliance and enforcement efforts and related data. I'll touch on the revisions to the enforcement policy, which were recently adopted by the state board, and they're not in force yet, but I'll talk about that. I'll give an update on our supplemental environmental projects, and then talk about our priorities for the coming fiscal year. Sorry. So, just in brief, the goals of our enforcement policy are to be able to work with the regulated community, first of all, to anticipate and correct violations, and so to make sure we get compliance. The second is to make sure that we're deterring harmful conduct, so people who would knowingly act, against the policies. And then the third goal of our program is to foster consistency between all of our programs and between our offices as much as possible. And I wanted to, throughout the presentation, I'll be talking about compliance and enforcement, and I just wanted to make sure we have those defined a little bit. So by enforcement, when I talk about enforcement, I'm talking mostly about formal efforts to obtain compliance or bring facilities into compliance. But when we talk about compliance, I'm mostly thinking about figuring out whether permit conditions are being adhered to, or monitoring plans or enforcement orders, and that compliance efforts largely revolve around inspections, reviewing reports, putting things in databases, and that sort of thing. And so compliance efforts on the behalf of the staff take generally the bulk of staff time. So that's what their efforts are largely encompassed, is in reviewing those reports, making sure that permit requirements are met, et cetera. But the caveat to that is when we do get into formal enforcement, and especially when we get into enforcement efforts or things that come to the board, administrative, civil liabilities, et cetera, any any particular item can take a lot of staff time once we get to that level. We generally don't get to that level. We try not to get to that, but that can happen. I also wanted to mention what we have in terms of split function and how that works in terms of items that are brought to the board. So we have a prosecution team. So I'm the lead prosecutor for the region, and then Clint Snyder and Clay Rogers are the leads for the Reading and Fresno offices. And so the prosecution team is involved in doing the investigations, bringing prosecution items to the board, and developing the orders themselves, cleanup and abatement orders, cease and desist orders, administrative civil liability orders. And then the other side of that is the board, who has the adjudicatory responsibility, of course, and then the advisory team led by the executive officer, who provides advice to the board in their decision making, and then on ruling on the proposed orders that are brought by the prosecution team. And so as a result of that split function, the prosecution team does not communicate with the board or with the advisory team outside of open board meetings.
Andrew, how do you determine who's going to be on the prosecution team? So certainly I imagine that if it's a specialized area, then you have someone specialized from that team. But when it comes to sort of the management part, do you call on consistent team members all the time, or how is that decided?
Well, so usually, it would be determined by who's in the program, and so some of our programs are already have a split between permitting and enforcement, and so then it's very clear the enforcement staff are the ones who take that that piece on. And some of our other programs, there isn't that clear split, and then usually it's a matter of which staff and their seniors and their managers have been involved in that particular site or with that particular discharger, and so that's how we split that up. Next, I wanted to mention briefly just our tools and processes. So the first is in terms of the authority that we have in enforcement. It comes from the Water Code and then the Federal Clean Water Act, and then the tools that we use are largely what's contained in the state's water quality enforcement policy. The enforcement policy, which, as I mentioned, has been revised, deals with prioritizing enforcement actions. It talks about a progressive enforcement approach, which I'll get into a little more detail later, but basically starting off with the lowest level of enforcement or lowest level of communication, and then progressing upward if things don't work at the lower levels. It has a penalty methodology, which is something when we come to the board We always present that to the board, but basically it walks through different factors of how you determine what an appropriate penalty should be, and really is a way of showing our work and how we arrived at a particular penalty. And then it also talks about alternatives to payment, which could be things like enhanced compliance projects or supplemental environmental projects, which I'll touch on a little later as well. In terms of staffing, so we have 142 out of our 250 or so staff who are involved in some way in compliance or enforcement. Now, out of those 142 staff, there's actually about a little less than 57 person years of work. So not all of those staff are working full-time doing compliance and enforcement. Some have small pieces of it and some do work full-time, but in aggregate it comes out to about 57 person years. And so that 57 or 56.7 person years is approximately 23% of our staff resources that are in compliance and enforcement. In terms of the programs that that do compliance and enforcement, this is just a list of the programs. I mentioned that several of our programs do have a firm sort of split and completely different staff who work on compliance and enforcement versus permitting. Those programs are the NPDES program, the Title 27, and our Non-15 or Discharge to Land program. The other programs have sort of a mix of staff who can work on both permitting and enforcement. So the first piece of our enforcement efforts are related to inspections, and so that's staff going out in the field, looking over site conditions, also looking over documentation and reporting that dischargers have on site. So, and then in terms of the numbers of inspections, this just shows the range of inspection numbers for all of the regions, all the regional boards. In calendar year 2016, we in this region conducted about 1,800 inspections, and there is a caveat to that, which I'll mention. This is based on data that's in our CWIX system, and not all of our programs report into CWIX, and so these are actually somewhat lower than what our actual inspections are for the year.
All Region 4 and Region 8, if I'm not mistaken, those are primarily their stormwater programs.
I believe that's correct, yes, Dr. Longley.
And these are really not weighted equally in many respects.
That's right, and so the one thing which I will touch on in a subsequent slide is this doesn't include, for example, our irrigated lands program, which accounts for about 4,000 inspections just in and of itself. So it's, yeah.
1,800 number you mentioned, that was just for this past year?
That for calendar year 2016, that's correct. So in addition to just the normal compliance inspections, going out to sites on a regular basis and finding out what's going on, we also respond to complaints. Those complaints can be submitted to us in a number of different ways through, there's an online form on the Cali PA website. They can also, of course, be called in or emailed in to the three offices. So in over the 16-17 fiscal year, we had a little over 200 complaints that we received. 160 of those have been completely addressed. Often addressing them it may involve referring it to other agencies. So, for example, sometimes we get complaints that turn out to be more like code violation complaints or those sorts of things, and so those would get forwarded on to the appropriate county agency, for example, or onto other state agencies as appropriate. And then the remaining 42 or the remaining 20% or so, staff are in the process of addressing either through additional investigations or additional enforcement efforts.
I have a question for you. So if somebody goes on and to Cali PA and files a complaint, and then that's direct, then they can forward it on to our department, correct?
Yeah. So what happens is it goes to like a central, I guess, a central person at Cali PA who then determines how it should be routed. And so that's generally how we get those. They're routed to us as appropriate. And then in terms of the violations that we've seen, again, this is just showing a comparison between the regions, and so we saw approximately 5,000 or so violations in calendar year 2016.
Andrew, is that a complete number?
Again, I should have caveated that as well. That is just the numbers that are in the CWIX database, and so that doesn't include our irrigated lands and a couple other programs. And the other thing which I forgot to note is when I went through the list of programs that do compliance and enforcement, the two programs that weren't included there are our site cleanup program and our underground storage tank program, which are both enforcement programs sort of in and of themselves, but they're considered separate from the rest of our formal enforcement efforts because they're handled in a much different manner than going through the enforcement policy and that sort of thing in general. So this pyramid represents the progressive enforcement, which I referred to earlier, where we try to start out with the lower levels of enforcement and informal enforcement actions, which can be things just like verbal communication, for example. And then sort of as we go up the pyramid, we sort of progress in the seriousness of the enforcement efforts. So investigative orders, formal investigative orders, cleanup and abatement orders, cease and desist orders, and then administrative civil liability orders. And you can see, so we have for calendar year 2016, there were 55 administrative civil liabilities that were adopted, but 29 of those were for mandatory minimum penalties, so where we had no discretion in terms of bringing those ACLs.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Andrew, so your top number, the 55.
Yeah.
Is that the number that was actually brought before the board, or are those the ones that the board approved, or what that number?
That were approved in some way by the board or by the advisory team on behalf of the board.
So just because there's only 55 that were approved doesn't mean that you didn't present and prosecute before this body more than that, right?
Well, we presented directly to the board in open hearing much less than that. And
Right.
I don't know what that number is, but it's probably on the order of 20 of those, I believe.
And those are counted in here
Those
regardless
are counted
of the
in
board's
there.
action?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's correct. These are just adopted orders. That's correct.
And those 29 MMP, how many of those were small, oftentimes disadvantaged communities?
I'm not sure of that offhand, Dr. Longley. It is if I had to venture a guess, I'd say it's maybe a third of them.
Okay.
But I'm not exactly sure. I could find that out for you.
I had a question about the informal enforcement actions.
Mm-hmm.
Give me an idea, are a small number, a large number of those just flat out ignorance of the rules or ignorance of a deadline and they missed it, that kind of stuff?
I think a lot of those are can frankly be things like just simple mistakes, like not getting a report in on time, and it's just a matter of, okay, we give them a call and the report comes in, and that sort of thing. And so I'd say in general those are just for lack of a better way of saying, people just need a reminder, and that's a simple reminder, and they get whatever needs to be done. And usually they're not very serious matters at all either. Just like I said, a report that needs to come, or something relatively simple like that. And then so I wanted to just mention the irrigated lands in terms of the numbers, and I already touched on this. So this is in addition to the numbers that you've seen. So we did 4,000 inspections in calendar year 2016 for irrigated lands. We sent out 13 directives to enroll or get regulatory coverage, and 400 notices of violation. And again, we're following the same progressive enforcement that we would do with anything. And what we see is that, as with all of our programs, it's quite effective, and they're a relatively small number that progress through ACLs.
So the caveat is that the ACLs number that you saw on the pyramid, those are recorded in CWIC. So regardless of the program, they're always entered into CWIC because that's our accounts receivable process. So if a discharger or an individual grower gets an ACL order against them, it goes into our public database.
Right, even though the NOV or whatever may not be in the public database. That's right. So I just wanted to then briefly go through each of those kind of levels or enforcement tools. So again, informal enforcement actions, those are things issued by staff. They're not specifically defined in statute. There can be phone calls, emails, letters, notices of violation are also encompassed in that. The second category, which is unique to the stormwater program and is defined in statute for the stormwater program, are stormwater notices of non-compliance, and there's some very specific rules about what those are and how they're issued. The next sort of major category is our investigative orders, and so these are orders that we send out to require technical reports, and so oftentimes this is where we think there may be a compliance issue. We're not sure of all the facts. We may not have all the technical data, and this is a way of making sure that we receive that technical data. And one of the things about these orders is if a discharger is non-responsive to the order, that can then be escalated and potentially result in an administrative civil liability, for example.
So these are, when an investigative order is issued, there's a required response.
That's correct.
What about cost on those? Is there an analysis or?
There is not an analysis of the cost, no.
So it could be significant if.
It could be. I mean, I think generally they are requests for information that we would otherwise require.
If I could interrupt, 13267 orders do have a consideration of costs. They are required by statute to have a consideration of costs. So it is incorporated. I think it's not a cost-benefit analysis per se, and I think that's what Andrew's getting at there. But there is a general consideration of a balancing between the interests of the state in obtaining the information required by the 13267 or 13383 order and the general costs of compliance with that order. And again, it's not a cost-benefit analysis, but it is a consideration of what the state's interest in receiving that information is versus what the burden that is going to be imposed on the recipient of that order is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Patrick.
Can you give me an idea of what triggers this investigative order? What kinds of things trigger it?
So for example, we find out about a violation, for example, an overflow or a discharge, and so we know there's a violation, but we don't know the circumstances of that violation. So what happened? Was there, was a valve open? Was there not enough capacity? Was there something that was out of the control of the discharger? That's, we want to find out those sorts of things, but we'll also ask for things like the volume of the discharge and the characteristics of the discharge. Those will be the types of things that we'd be asking for in general.
And am I correct, when we do see an ACL, generally it starts off with a 13267?
Oftentimes,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, there are a number of, especially the MMPs, which don't. Those are generally self-reported.
Exactly. Good examples of the 13267 also is in Clay's oil field program. The sumps, when we found out how many sumps there were, and well, that's a new program for us in many ways, and when he found out how many sumps there were, the 13267s resulted to determine what the issues were. Am I correct, Clay? Okay. I see Clay nodding yes.
Yes.
So I have this triggered you said if something was beyond the control of the discharger, maybe this is a lawyer question, what is the standard for violation? Is it strict liability? You're in violation because it happened, or, I mean, I know on the air side it's strict liability all the time, so I was just curious.
Yeah, it depends on the circumstances of the order. There are some requirements that are strict liabilities requirements. There are others where there is an ability to put in to the board some mitigating circumstances, and oftentimes those are crafted by the requirements of the orders themselves. And essentially, the way the court treats an order is much like the interpretation of a contract. So if there's terminology and provisions in the order that impose very strict liability, or in certain cases, cleanup liability and Clean Water Act liability specific to specific provisions of those orders are strict liability, then those will be held to a strict liability standard. But most of the time, the board has some discretion to grant some mitigation based on factors out of the control, force majeure, things like that. And those are often spelled out in the permit itself, act of God, something like that. They're often spelled out in the regulations of the permit themselves. So it's variable. I think that's why you see a lot of debate when the board is adopting a permit as to the precise wording, often from the attorneys for the dischargers, because when that permit is interpreted by Andrew's group, the ramifications of interpreting liability one way versus interpreting liability another way often can have very dramatic potential monetary consequences for the dischargers.
So next I wanted to just briefly touch on cleanup and abatement orders. So these are orders that address either a discharge or a threatened discharge. They require, as the name indicates, to clean up and abate either the threat or the effect. They're generally can be done in a relatively short term. They're issued under delegated authority, but they must be approved by the executive officer on behalf of the board. And again, violations of cleanup and abatement orders could trigger an ACL or a time schedule order, or even potentially a referral to the Attorney General. Then we have time schedule orders and cease and desist orders, which are similar types of orders, but they do have a few important differences. The main ones being that cease and desist order orders immediate compliance. They're also, cease and desist orders are used to generally give dischargers time to come into compliance with permit requirements, for example. And in that case, the board, often working with the dischargers, but not always, establishes that schedule. Cease and desist orders must be adopted by the board, whereas time schedule orders can be issued under delegated authority. And the other thing, the cease and desist order in terms of additional enforcement, if it's not met, could be referred directly to the Attorney General. And there's a little bit, for a time schedule order, there's a little bit more of a process to take subsequent enforcement. And then finally, talking about administrative civil liability orders. So liabilities that are imposed by the board, they must be adopted by the board or by and they can also be resolved through settlement. Those settlements would generally be approved by the executive officer on behalf of the board. There are multiple water code sections that can result in ACLs. Again, we utilize the penalty methodology in the enforcement policy to determine what the proposed liabilities are. There are the numbers again that we talked about, and then also to mention we've talked with the board in the past couple months about our new process for compressed ACLs, which essentially truncate the amount of work that needs to be done by staff, and the orders themselves are very short. We still go through the same methodology, and they essentially result in settlements with the discharger. I mean, that's the main option. If the compressed ACL isn't settled by the discharger, then we would go through a full ACL and bring that to the board. And in general, what we've found is that so far we've mainly focused on our stormwater program for these ACLs and for the compressed ACLs, and they tend to work a lot better where there's really just a kind of a black and white violation, if you will. So for the stormwater cases, what we do is attach an inspection report. The inspection report showed exactly what the violations were, pictures, they're relatively sort of obvious things. And it was sort of easy to do that in that manner. And I think they'll also work for things like reporting violations, reports not received, where it's sort of a matter of was the report done or wasn't it, where it's relatively straightforward. And so our next step, which we've talked with the board about, is actually trying to use these with the irrigated lands program for dischargers who either don't have permit coverage or who haven't done the required reporting. So that's sort of our next step with that.
If I could just, he said that the EO would usually do the settlement. It's the advisory team, which is made up of the board chair, the board vice chair, Patrick, I, and Adam, and so it's not just done by me alone. So I just wanted to clarify that. I also, if you could go back to the pyramid for the new board members in particular. So he talked about the progressive enforcement. This is the progressive enforcement, and he went through each of these steps now in detail on what we do. But the majority of our time is spent in informal as opposed to formal, because if you look, the severity goes up as the egregious nature of the violations occur, but on the other side, the resources go up. So it's always in board staff best interest to try and resolve these things and get our dischargers into compliance at the lower levels, so that we can use our resources to continue to do more compliance and outreach, especially where we're trying now to add in more compliance assistance for some of our smaller, less sophisticated dischargers. So I just wanted to point that out. You only tend to see the informal ones, it's cease and desist orders and the ACLs. That's when you guys get involved as a board usually, and also all the rest of the work is done below that level, and it is quite a bit of work on the part of staff.
And if I could clarify, the board chair and the board vice chair aren't quite on the advisory team, but for the purposes of making the pre-hearing rulings, that is something that the advisory team consults with the board chair, because the board chair acts as hearing officer, and often the vice chair is involved in those conversations for controversial matters.
And Carl, first I want to apologize for everybody for being a little bit late this morning, but I'm here. I heard most of the questions from the board was about the top of the pyramid. I think this is really useful to say, yeah, we have a pyramid of enforcement, and most of the easier things are at the bottom and there's fewer near the top. But a lot of questions about the top were asked, I think, and I think a little more information, like where are those things, why are those problems happening, and which programs have the most problematic issues with them. And what I'm thinking of as a board and our policy direction is, you know, where should we be looking at maybe with our resources in terms of addressing the most problematic areas? And this doesn't quite give us that kind of information, but I think as a board we should be kind of looking at where might our enforcement priorities be. And I'm sure our executive officer Pamela already looks at that, because she has to be aware of that in terms of where to allocate resources and such. But I think that might be helpful to.
Yes, absolutely. And I will talk a little bit about, touch on some of our priorities for the coming year, which are based on some of what you just mentioned.
And aside from that, I heard you went with climbing with this guy that soloed El Cap without a rope recently.
Yeah,
I'm
yes,
sorry,
that
that's
is
sort of an
correct.
aside, but.
From my standpoint, that's a test of your sanity.
Well, I also recently did Mount Talac, which was quite enjoyable. So I wanted to then touch on the revisions to the enforcement policy. These were adopted by the state board in April. They are still not in force. They still need to be approved by the Office of Administrative Law, and so we're not using the new the revised enforcement policy yet, but sometime this year those revisions we assume they'll be approved, but assuming they are approved by OAL, we will start using these revisions. But I wanted to just discuss those with the board, because you will start to see ACLs in particular that will follow this policy and with probably in the coming few months. The first thing that the policy did is it clarified a lot of the language throughout in terms of what the requirements were, how the methodology is used, et cetera. I think we feel that in terms of getting settlements, especially, having that language clearer will help us to reach settlements more quickly. Having more clarity means there's less things to dispute, really. I mean, and there's less kind of room for interpretation, I guess. And so hopefully that puts everybody on the same page in terms of how the violations are considered, et cetera. There have been changes to how the classes of violations are defined. In the current policy, there are 3 classes or levels of violation depending on severity. In the new policy, there's 2 classes. Class A, which is essentially the most severe violations, and that's enumerated what is meant by that. And then Class B is everything else. And so that's a simpler way of looking at classifying violations. There are several changes to the penalty methodology itself. There was, in the current policy, it's what's called the characteristics of the discharge, and that's been renamed to just be the toxicity. It's a little simpler to understand. And then both the toxicity and the potential for harm, the definitions of those have been clarified. Those are often things that come into dispute or there's disagreement about between the prosecution team and the dischargers as to how those are defined. And so the new policy helps with that. in the enforcement policy, there's the potential for when there are discharge violations and penalties are assessed on a per gallon basis. There's the potential to reduce the dollar per gallon charge, and that's largely based on what's termed high volume discharges. In the existing policy, there's no numerical guidance given as to what a high volume discharge is. In the revised policy, a high volume discharge is considered to be between 100,000 and 2 million gallons. And so that gives guidance on when that per gallon penalty can be reduced. And then if it's above 2 million gallons, it can potentially be reduced even more, as low as down to $1 a gallon. There are changes in the conduct factors, violator conduct factors, and those are things like the history of violation, their culpability, their cleanup and cooperation. And again, both the definitions have changed as well as sort of the numeric ranges there's some changes to those. Again, there's also the ability when there are per day violations to compress the days, and we've talked about that in a number of cases before the board. And basically, the formula for how that compression is done is changed in the revised policy, and essentially it makes it a little more equitable for shorter term violations. And then there's also a little more guidance given on if we wish to try to recover staff costs, which we hadn't done under the existing policy for a number of reasons. A little more guidance given on how that can be done.
This was, I understand, a bookkeeping problem at the state board.
I guess that's how it could be characterized.
One way to
We need to be able to account accurately
Exactly.
for what
And so this was adopted by the state board when?
I'm sorry. So the revised enforcement policy was adopted in April.
Okay.
There's more guidance given on how to recover staff costs, but there isn't a particular, I guess, methodology or tracking system for doing that as of now.
Good point, I got to remember. I think that it bothers me when we commit all kinds of resources and can't get that back in some form. And, okay, I like to see it there, and I'm glad that they're thinking about it and they retained it.
Dr. Long, we still have to get some clarification. I know that OE has insisted we can do this, but we were audited on our water quality certification, and one of the items that we were it wasn't positive. It was an item in the audit that needed to be addressed was not properly accounting for time for staff, and we don't have a proper accounting process. So I don't know if we can start doing that right away until we can be able to validate staff time spent on ACLs. I too would like to recover the staff time, but I think we have to have a formal process.
I think that's something we need to be actively working on.
And if I could add, there are a couple legal considerations to keep in mind. First, the cost of the permit fees actually includes the oversight and compliance and enforcement costs, and so that is when you pay your fees, you're also paying the board to police the WDRs or NPDES permits for the non-enrollment as well. So really the recovery of costs isn't strictly a one-to-one ratio. It's really a factor that we consider. You by your non-compliance have caused the board to expend this amount of money that could have been dedicated to processing permit applications, because oftentimes it comes out of the same pool of funds. And so that it's a consideration. And Pamela is exactly right. There are very high standards in terms of how we account for our time. It's not a blunt accounting. We have to make sure that the appropriate classifications of engineers, geologists, administrative staff are all accounted for, and how we account for our time spent on an enforcement case. And it's tough. I mean, it's tough to take a look at a permit and say, well, here's the line where we deem that all of a sudden we're taking a look at this as an enforcement case as opposed to a permit modification or as opposed to a routine inspection, things like that. So the modifications to the enforcement policy help at least clarify where that line begins and ends, and the standards by which the board will account for the time spent by various classifications in policing those WDRs. But again, it's just a consideration in assessing a penalty, because sometimes you run through the penalty methodology and staff, the discharger may have been causing staff and to run around in circles for months to get at something that didn't have that much of a cost associated with it or that much of a water quality problem associated with it. And so when you have that type of a rigmarole that you go through, you want to be able to assess a higher penalty because of that type of behavior. And the new enforcement policy gives clear metrics for doing that. And the last thing I should mention, especially for the new board members, the funds assessed from compliance costs are not rolled into the Office of Enforcement's general operating budget. It's kind of illegal to have an incentive scheme. The more enforcement that you get, the more funds that you get for doing more enforcement. We can't do that. Really, remember all the monies that we collect go generally into the cleanup and abatement account, sometimes into the waste discharge permit fund, but those funds are really allocated to cleanup proposals, to getting positive work done on the ground to rectify water quality impairments and water quality problems that are caused. Sometimes it's studies, sometimes it's more comprehensive activities, but I just want to keep that in mind when we're talking about
and that was
staff
a
costs.
case I was addressing, and we've seen it often. Dischargers will obfuscate an issue, and we expend tremendous resources to develop the case. And as you said, data was probably already available, but not available to us. And we're pulling those folks away from doing other things. If it goes up a cleanup and abatement account, that's fine. It certainly can be put to good use to address water quality issues. I just don't like to see people using our staff unneedlessly. I'm not looking for double dipping, I'm looking for equity.
And again, all of these revisions are not in force yet, but will be when and if the.
What are we looking for, about a year?
My understanding was it was on the order of 6 months.
6 months,
and that
okay.
was from
The end
April.
of the year.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, sometime this year is what we
So
would expect.
I had a question on that last bullet. Once it's approved by OAL, it will be applied to everything that we catch moving forward, applied to things that are already in the queue. How does that work?
You know what? To be honest,
That's
I'm still waiting to hear from. We're supposed to get a briefing soon from the Office of Enforcement on exactly
Okay.
how they'll.
I'd love to hear
propose
that
handle
answer
that.
when you.
Yeah.
When you
Well, I think, John, what's going to happen is I would like the board to have a briefing on it once it's approved by OEL.
Yeah.
I think that's appropriate. We certainly have been briefed before on the enforcement policy. I think we need to be briefed on the update.
Do we have a chance to be involved in the process of this, or who's,
The
does
process
our board chair and board vice chair get involved?
of the update itself.
Yeah, all of these changes.
Well, so there was a public process. It extended over most of a year. Certainly, our staff and the staff from the other regional boards were very engaged in that process, and commenting and I guess assisting with that.
It's difficult to speak for all the regional board chairs, but I think this was one item that the confidence was in staff, and we didn't need the regional board chair's involvement to any degree. Certainly, we were aware of it.
So just quickly, just a couple last quick things. I wanted to give an update on supplemental environmental projects. So in calendar year 16, we had over $750,000 of monies that were assessed through administrative civil liabilities through settlements of those. Went to supplemental environmental projects. Almost all of those went to projects within our Disadvantaged Communities Initiative, which was a board-approved initiative and has projects that are pre-approved by the board. There were 8 projects that constituted that $750,000. So far in 2017, there's been another $425,000 awarded in that program, and we have, I should mention, we have settlements in principle that haven't been fully drawn up yet for over $1 million in additional supplemental environmental projects that we expect for this year. The supplemental environmental project policy itself, so there's a separate policy in addition to the enforcement policy that's being updated this year. Among other things, there was a recent state law that requires all of the boards and departments in Cal EPA to develop a program modeled on what this board initiated for disadvantaged communities, and so that's something that'll be reflected in that policy update, among other things. And then lastly, on the SEPs, we also have a Delta Regional Monitoring Program initiative that was approved by the board last year. We haven't yet been able to fund a project through that for a number of reasons, but we actually have a settlement that we believe will be able to give us our first funding for a SEP for that program as well.
Andrew, go back, please.
Yeah.
On those projects, was that with the Rose Foundation?
Yes, those are Rose
partnership
Foundation.
that we've
Yes,
done?
that's correct.
Yeah, I think that's personally one of the really valuable programs that we implemented moving forward. I think, we have to assess these fees, and a lot of times they're against municipalities or other organizations. And I think it benefits them and us to know that a lot of this funding is being directly funneled into programs that help these disadvantaged communities, and we all know how difficult that's been in terms of nitrates and other concerns. So I'm happy to see this, and I know we've had presentations occasionally from the Rose Foundation on this, and I'm glad to hear that legislation is causing others to follow in these footsteps, because I think people like to know their dollars are being, whether they're tax dollars or penalty dollars, that they're being effectively used, and I think this is one very effective way of using them. Thanks.
Yeah, and I should mention that of those 8 projects, they were spread throughout the region. So we had 1 or 2 in the northern part of the region, and several in the southern, and so throughout the region
Just to expand on this a little more for the new board members, is these projects were difficult to implement because our board would have to supervise them. They were all had to be individually crafted. Nobody knew quite what the projects were. But working with the Rose Foundation, we have projects that they're already working on that can provide funding to accomplish goals that are already outlined and have infrastructure to implement them. And so to date, I think this funding and these projects have been incredibly successful.
And not to keep this item keep going, but can you refresh my memory on if someone accepts a SEP, it only sort of counts if the SEP actually is completed?
That's correct.
And by going through the Rose Foundation, is that requirement eased, or is there still that requirement?
Yes, that requirement is eased in terms of once the project is chosen, the specific project is chosen and it's outlined, and the monies are paid at that point, that portion of the liability is
Great,
considered
thank you.
accounted for. And maybe Patrick might want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, no, I for better or for worse, I've been involved in a lot of discussions with the state board, other agencies about how to do this properly, or not properly, within the existing SEP policy and what the new SEP policy should say. Bear in mind that US EPA, a number of other organizations, their SEPs, the discharger is done when they cut the check, excuse me, to the individual or the organization performing the SEP. It's a little different in the state of California, at least under the water boards, in that we require the SEP to be completed by whomever before fully suspending the liability. Now, in the case with the Rose Foundation essentially acts as a guarantor that they've got the track record that they are going to spend the money. They give periodic reports to the Central Valley Water Board every January, I believe, demonstrating how they have spent the money. And frankly, because of their track record of executing projects appropriately and having good oversight of the projects that they oversee, folks are comfortable letting the Rose Foundation be the guarantor. And so the board has frankly extended the SEP policy as far as it can go in allowing the dischargers to sort of get off the hook when they write the check to the Rose Foundation, understanding that the Rose Foundation will come back and make the demonstration. It will be the guarantor that this work will get done, the funds will get spent. Bear in mind that in 2009, when the SEP policy was adopted, there was fairly miserable accounting of SEP monies, and a lot of SEPs weren't getting spent. So the 2009 SEP policy was really a reaction to that. And now I think the state board is very much considering, is that requirement, given that accounting has improved dramatically, is that requirement still something that they want to hold the regional boards to, hold dischargers to, or do they want to relax that so that we can get more money out into organizations that are doing good work within the communities, specifically disadvantaged communities. So that's an ongoing conversation at the state board when they revise the SEP policy, which they're doing right now.
Great, thank you.
How much longer do you have
I
to
have
go?
one more slide.
Good. And are we going to have anything in closed session, Patrick?
Not today.
Good. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so my last slide is just the priority areas that we're proposing for 2017, and we've talked with the board about a number of these. The first is in the irrigated lands program. We want to, of course, continue to focus on getting everybody enrolled who should be enrolled in the program and getting them permit coverage, but also broadening our enforcement efforts to include more reporting violations. So people who haven't filled out the appropriate farm evaluations or nitrogen management plans, et cetera, we're going to do more enforcement related to those. But the other piece of that is, and this is sort of reflected from some of our experiences with some of the dischargers in the program, is to actually work more on the compliance side as well. And so one of the things we've done is create a brochure, real sort of simple trifold and plain language brochure that we will send out to all the dischargers when they receive notices from us, that explains what the program is and what the requirements of the program are in a way that hopefully is a lot more understandable to the general public than some of our legal notices and things like that. And so we hope that that'll be something that'll help people to come into compliance who may not otherwise understand what the program is about.
Question for you, Andrew. What are you looking at as far as the reporting violations? What is staff considering?
In terms of what types, or
Yeah, what are you for people not reporting, because that was a big issue this
Right.
past year. How are you looking at addressing?
Yeah, so I guess depending on the coalition and when the specific permit was adopted, there are different timelines in there, and so it depends on where the dischargers within a particular coalition, what their requirements are. But we're certainly looking at the farm evaluations, but we do want to spend a great deal of focus on the nitrogen management plans. I think that's where we want to have a particular focus on those.
I have a question for you. So when you're a part of the coalition, and let's say you're a farmer, but you're not turning in your annual evaluations, does the coalition notify these farmers that, is there any communication there?
I believe so.
Yes, well, Bruce can speak if he would like, but the coalitions do try to retrieve that information. They're not going to take on the enforcement role, but they do their effort to try and get the member to submit the information to them. And I don't know if there's a precise number of times they go out, but eventually it gets turned over to the regional board.
That does it. And I will say, and through the efforts of the coalitions, we've had a number of coalitions where we had missing reports or the like, and the coalitions put in a good deal of effort, and there were several where they reduced that number to 0. So through their efforts.
And I'll note that this was an issue of concern when we adopted the program, as to whether the coalitions would have an enforcement role. Maybe Bruce is going to speak to that, but we certainly didn't want to put them in that position, and I think that's where we ended up.
So Bruce, give us a
Bruce,
concise.
well, before
Valley
Bruce,
Water Quality
Bruce
Coalition,
speaks.
hungry. I'm hungry.
Hang on,
Hold on, Bruce.
Just be hungry a minute more. I just wanted to say, I thought you were asking that question as a test to see which of the coalition members were listening. And clearly Bruce was and Dave wasn't, so.
Dave's getting ready. Yes, Commissioners, to answer your question, multiple times do we outreach. It's a member requirement to turn in reports. A number of water quality coalitions have provided information already to your enforcement staff on those who haven't done it. If they haven't turned their reports in a couple of years, they go on a drop member list. They get a little bit more focused attention from Brett Stevens and his staff. So we do outreach, and it escalates, right? From just a simple email or a letter to certified documents to phone calls, multiple things. Because people have circumstances, whether it be family related or whether it be weather, and gosh darn, I meant to get to that. So extensive.
We're dealing throughout the region with about 35,000 people, and you're going to find all kinds of things going on with 35,000 people.
And how many coalitions? Do we have a number?
14 is what it was. Okay, so the second bullet is that we want to focus on is some of our wastewater treatment plants. This year, with all of the extensive storms and the heavy rainfall, we had quite a number of plants that had compliance issues related to overflows, things of that nature. And we want to work with them to try to figure out what some of the causes of those might have been, and if there are ways to mitigate those in the future, in future heavier rain years. And so we've sent out some of those orders for technical information, and once we're starting to get that information back from the dischargers, and as we do, we'll work both with individual dischargers on issues they will have had, as well as through Civicqua and others on if there are sort of broader issues that can be addressed, across those multiple dischargers.
Did you choose these photos?
Yes.
That's a very interesting photo. I'll talk to you more about it later. The bottom
okay.
one.
Well, I had a comment on that too. And the bottom photo is a really good illustration of mixing or lack thereof.
Or lack of mixing.
And
Yeah,
you
that's
often
what-
get this when you have temperature changes or turbidity
Yep.
differences, but water, when it flows together, operates in more of a laminar flow than a mixing turbulence. And
Yeah,
this is
this-
a good illustration.
The way it's
Glaciers do
hugging the
that,
bank
too.
there out of that one tributary is amazing.
Yeah, and so this is from this year and is on the Yuba River. So, And then the last priority area, which I've talked about, is once we get the new enforcement policy approved, is implementing that policy. So that's what I have.
Any
Thank
further
you.
questions or comments? Go ahead, John.
Appreciate it, and it's been an interesting year in enforcement. We had the subgroups, right? We had some big cases, and I know there's a constant efforts to improve, and I just want to encourage that to continue as we move forward, because enforcement's always, I think, one of the hardest things for the actual board members. It's a lot of facts and figures and testimonies and everything, and it just makes it's tough to deal with. But if you don't have enforcement, then it's not fair to everybody who's spending the money to do it right. And so it's certainly important, and I encourage you to keep up the good work.
And to repeat what I said earlier, but in a little more detail, before we see the first enforcement action involving the new enforcement policy, we would certainly appreciate a briefing on that policy.
Yes, absolutely.
Any further comments? Yes, Ms. EO?
I don't have any, Dr. Longley. I was just going to point out that our short item is.
Yes, and we're going to have a lot of folks back here at 1 o'clock. And we want to get on to the bovine, which is second one this afternoon.
I think we could be back by 1:15.
Well, let's say not later than 1:15. That's 40 minutes.